Before we begin, take a slow breath. Find a comfortable position. Let your body settle. This is not a story that demands your urgency. It is a story that will carry you gently, steadily, across the grey waters of the North Atlantic, down through the cold steel corridors of submarines, and back into a world that no longer exists. A world of men who are handed an impossible task on an impossible sea. There is something quietly extraordinary about the ocean at night. Under a moonless sky, the water does not roar or threaten. It simply moves, patient and indifferent, as it always has and always will. On those same waters, between the years of 1939 and 1945, something extraordinary unfolded. A navy built in defiance, launched in secrecy, and destroyed in catastrophe fought the most prolonged maritime struggle in the history of modern warfare. Not the largest navy, not the most powerful navy, but perhaps the most complicated one. This is the full history of the Kriegsmarine, Germany's war navy. A force born from humiliation, shaped by one man's ambition, and ultimately consumed by the weight of a war it was never designed to fight. Tonight, we are going to take it slowly. There is no rush here. The story will last as long as you need it to, so close your eyes when you are ready and let the words carry you. If you find yourself drifting off before we reach the end, that is perfectly fine. That is exactly the point. Chapter 1. The Ashes of Versailles. There is a particular kind of silence that follows total defeat. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of a nation stripped to its foundations, sitting in the rubble of everything it once believed it was. Germany, in the autumn of 1918, knew that silence well. The guns had stopped. The Kaiser had abdicated. The fleet, once the second most powerful in the world, sat at anchor in the northern waters of Scapa Flow in Scotland, awaiting its fate under the watchful eyes of Allied guard ships. It was a humiliating arrangement, and the German sailors who remained on those vessels knew it with every cold grey morning that passed. What happened next would echo through the next 3 decades of German history. On the 21st of June 1919, before the formal signing of the Treaty of Versailles, the German Admiral Ludwig von Reuter gave a silent order. Across the interned fleet, seacocks were opened, valves were turned, and water began flooding into the hulls of more than 50 German warships. By the end of that day, the majority of the German high seas fleet lay on the bottom of Scapa Flow. The British guards watched in stunned disbelief. The Germans called it a final act of defiance. The Allies called it a provocation. Whatever name you give it, it was the end of one era, and though no one knew it yet, the fragile beginning of another. The Treaty of Versailles arrived weeks later, with its full weight. Germany was permitted a navy of 15,000 personnel in total, 6 capital ships, no more than 10,000 tons each, 6 cruisers, 12 destroyers, 12 torpedo boats, and absolutely no submarines. The weapon that had come closest to severing Britain's supply lines and winning the war through economic strangulation. The naval provisions of Versailles were not merely punitive, they were designed to make the German Navy a coastal defence force at best, a symbolic institution at worst. The men who remained in that diminished service were career officers with no fleet left to command, no purpose left to pursue, and no future they could point to with any confidence. Into this institutional grief stepped a figure who would carry the Navy's identity for the next quarter century. Erich Raeder was born on the 24th of April, 1876, in the Hamburg suburb of Wandsbek, the son of a schoolteacher. He had entered the Imperial German Navy in 1894 and risen steadily through a career built on discipline, study, and a gift for institutional administration. During the First World War, he had served as Chief of Staff to the commander of the German cruiser fleet, earning a reputation not for flamboyance but for methodical competence. He was not the kind of man who inspired songs or made speeches that moved audiences to their feet. He was the kind of man who arrived early, read every document carefully, and still believed in the institution when the institution had almost nothing left to believe in. By 1922, Raeder held the rank of Rear Admiral in what was now called the Kriegsmarine, the Republic's navy. The organization he managed was stripped, watched, and constrained. But Raeder understood something that many around him did not. The restrictions of Versailles had set a ceiling on what Germany could build openly. They said nothing, not definitively, not yet about what could be studied, planned, and quietly prepared. The German Navy began building something that no treaty could easily measure: intellectual capital. Officers studied foreign navies. Engineers quietly explored the specifications of weapon systems they were not permitted to build. The foundations of a future fleet were being laid not in steel, but in paper and thought. The 1920s were a decade of slow reconstruction in Germany, and the Kriegsmarine reflected the contradictions of the era perfectly. Publicly, it was a modest coastal force. Privately, it maintained connections with Swedish and Dutch shipbuilding firms where submarine design work continued under cover of commercial contracts. By the early 1930s, Germany had quietly stockpiled much of the technical knowledge and component inventory needed to begin submarine construction the moment political conditions changed. This was not recklessness, it was planning. Long, patient, deliberate planning, carried out by men who had watched their institution be dismantled and had decided, collectively and quietly, that it would not stay that way. The political conditions changed on the 30th of January, 1933, when Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. For the naval establishment, this was a moment of profound ambiguity. Hitler was primarily a land power thinker. His strategic vision was built around armies and territory, not fleets and sea lanes. He admired the British Empire, but privately regarded British sea power as something to be negotiated with, not directly challenged. His early instinct was to seek an accommodation with Britain that would allow Germany to rearm on land and in the air while preserving British goodwill over naval questions. This would produce, just 2 years later, one of the most significant diplomatic arrangements in the pre-war period. On the 18th of June, 1935, the United Kingdom and Germany signed the Anglo-German Naval Agreement. Britain, in a move that alarmed France and effectively unilaterally revised the naval provisions of Versailles, agreed to allow Germany to build a surface fleet up to 35% of British tonnage, and a submarine force up to 45% of British submarine strength. It was a concession that the British government justified as pragmatic, better to manage German rearmament within an agreed framework than to watch it accelerate outside of any framework at all. Whether that logic was sound remains a matter for historians to debate. What is beyond debate is its immediate practical effect. Germany could now build submarines legally, and it moved quickly. Also, on the 1st of June, 1935 weeks before the agreement was even signed, Hitler had formally announced the existence of what he named the Kriegsmarine, the War Navy. It was not a new name applied to an existing service. It was a statement of intent, an act of declaration, a public announcement that the era of constraint was over. The Reichsmarine, cautious and careful, became the Kriegsmarine, assertive and politically subordinated to the new regime. Raeder was confirmed as its commander-in-chief, promoted eventually to the rank of Gross Admiral, the highest naval rank in Germany. He had spent 17 years holding the institution together. Now, at last, he had permission to begin building it into something. But permission and capability are different things. What Raeder wanted and what his naval planners believed was necessary to make Germany a genuine sea power was an enormous construction program. The vision that eventually solidified into what became known as Plan Z imagined a fleet of approximately 800 ships over 8 years, including 10 battleships, 4 aircraft carriers, 15 armoured ships, more than 40 light cruisers, and nearly 250 submarines. It was an audacious vision, and even its architects understood it would require years and extraordinary industrial commitment. The problem, already visible by the mid-1930s, though few in the naval leadership wished to acknowledge it directly, was that the German economy and German industrial capacity were being stretched simultaneously in every direction. The army wanted tanks and artillery, the Air Force wanted aircraft, the Navy wanted ships. The budget, vast as it was by the standards of the 1920s, could not satisfy all three with equal generosity. The Kriegsmarine, as the third priority of a three-service military, would enter the war it had been built to fight with a fleet that was, by any honest measure, not yet ready. Chapter 2. The Architects of the Deep. Every navy is ultimately shaped by the vision of the individuals who command it. The Kriegsmarine was no different. But what makes the story of this particular force unusual is the degree to which two men, occupying the same institutional role at different points in the war, represent almost opposite philosophies of naval warfare. One believed in the prestige and the psychology of the capital ship. The other believed in the mathematics of attrition at sea. Understanding those two men is to understand the Kriegsmarine's entire arc from 1935 to 1945. Eric Raeder was a surface navy man to his core. His formative experiences had been shaped by the age of the great warship, the era when battleships and battle cruisers were the centerpieces of national power, the instruments through which nations announced their seriousness to the world. He had served in the First World War and understood the psychological weight of a battle fleet. The Germans called it Flottenpolitik, fleet politics, the use of naval construction as a diplomatic and psychological instrument long before a single gun was fired in anger. Raeder believed that Germany's path to naval credibility ran through the construction of large, powerful surface ships, ships that could break out of the North Sea, threaten Atlantic trade routes, and force Britain into a strategic position it could not comfortably maintain. Karl Dönitz was something entirely different. Born in 1891, he had entered the submarine service during the First World War and survived the experience physically, though not entirely psychologically unscathed. He understood submarines in a way that only men who had lived inside them could. He understood their claustrophobic demands, their extraordinary mechanical vulnerability, their need for aggressive leadership, and their spectacular potential as instruments of economic warfare. If Britain depended on sea lanes for food, fuel, and material, then the weapon that severed those sea lanes was not a battleship, it was a submarine. Dönitz held this conviction with the kind of intensity that makes some men visionaries and others fanatics, and the line between the two is often only drawn in hindsight. The tension between Raeder's surface fleet ambitions and Dönitz's submarine advocacy was not merely a personal disagreement, it was a structural problem within the Kriegsmarine's resource allocation. In the pre-war years, the grand surface ship program took priority. Dönitz commanded the submarine arm from 1935 onwards, but he received a fraction of the industrial investment he believed was necessary. He had argued, with charts and calculations, that to strangle British supply lines he needed a minimum of 300 operational submarines. At the outbreak of war in September 1939, he had 57, of which only 22 were suited for Atlantic operations. This gap between what the submarine campaign required and what the Kriegsmarine could field would define the entire trajectory of the war at sea. The men who crewed those submarines were a distinct breed within the Kriegsmarine. Submarine service was not compulsory, it was a voluntary assignment, and it attracted men of a particular psychological type. They were younger, on average, than their surface fleet counterparts. They were comfortable with confined spaces, mechanical complexity, and the kind of long silences that submarines demand. They lived in vessels where the boundary between crew and machine became almost metaphysical, where every sound, every vibration, every shift in pressure told the trained ear something about the world outside the steel hull. These were men who trusted each other completely, because the alternative to trust in a submarine is a kind of madness. Above the submarine force, the surface fleet had its own culture, proud, formal, and in certain respects magnificently impractical. The great ships of the Kriegsmarine, the battleships, the battle cruisers, the so-called pocket battleships, were objects of extraordinary engineering accomplishment. Germany had always been a nation that excelled in the design and manufacture of precise, complex machinery, and its warships reflected this capacity at its highest level. The so-called pocket battleships Deutschland, Admiral Scheer, and Admiral Graf Spee were not technically battleships at all, but were officially designated Panzerschiff, or armoured ships. They were heavily gunned cruisers designed to operate as independent commerce raiders, capable of outgunning any ship fast enough to catch them and outrunning any ship powerful enough to threaten them. It was a clever concept in theory. The battle cruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau were the Kriegsmarine's most powerful active surface units in the first years of the war, and they reflected the same design philosophy writ large, fast, capable, intended for independent operations rather than fleet engagement. They were commissioned in the late 1930s and would go on to an operationally complex career that mixed genuine achievement with costly setback. In January of 1941, under Vice Admiral Günther Lütjens, the two ships conducted a raiding cruise into the Atlantic that lasted nearly 2 months and accounted for over 116,000 tons of Allied shipping sunk or captured. It was one of the genuine successes of German surface naval warfare, and it demonstrated what Raiders' surface fleet could accomplish when geography and operational timing aligned in its favor. But geography was the Kriegsmarine's permanent problem. Germany's coastline gave it access to the North Sea and the Baltic, both heavily contested, both easily monitored by British naval and air power. To reach the Atlantic, the ocean that mattered strategically, German surface ships had to run a gauntlet. They could attempt the northern passage between Iceland and Scotland, or the southern passage through the English Channel. Neither was comfortable. Both exposed ships to British reconnaissance, British naval forces, and, increasingly as the war progressed, British aircraft. Every major operation by a German surface ship in the Atlantic began with this fundamental geography problem, the awkward necessity of crossing the threshold. Raeder managed this problem as best he could, through operational deception, timing, and aggression. But managing it was not the same as solving it, and as the war lengthened and British maritime intelligence improved, the freedom of action available to German surface raiders steadily contracted. The Kriegsmarine had been designed for a war that would develop over years, giving it time to grow into Plan Z's ambitions. Instead, it found itself in a war that began before the first battleship of that plan had been completed, fighting with the fleet it had rather than the fleet it needed. The architects of the Kriegsmarine had built something genuinely formidable. They had simply not built quite enough of it, and what they had built was asked to operate in conditions that tested its design assumptions at every turn. The irony that Raeder and Dönitz both seemed to recognize, though they never expressed it in quite these terms, was that the Kriegsmarine was an institution defined by its constraints as much as its capabilities. A navy that could not have submarines until 1935, that received its full political authorization only 4 years before the war began, that was outprioritized by the Army and Air Force in budget terms, and that was geographically encircled. The moment hostilities opened, this was an institution fighting uphill from its first day in operation. And yet it fought, and for stretches of the war, it fought with extraordinary effectiveness. That paradox, a constrained navy achieving more than it had any structural right to, is what makes this story worth telling at all. Chapter 3. The pocket battleships go to sea. In the autumn of 1939, while the land war in Poland was still resolving itself, the German Naval Command was already moving pieces across the Atlantic. 3 armoured ships, Deutschland, Admiral Scheer, and Admiral Graf Spee, had been dispatched into open waters before the formal declaration of war, their captains carrying sealed orders they were not to open until the signal came. The logic was pre-positioning. Get the ships into the ocean before the British could close the exits, and then hold them there as latent threats to Allied shipping. It was a strategy rooted in the commerce raiding tradition, the same tradition that had animated German surface warfare in the First World War, the idea that you did not need to defeat an enemy fleet in battle if you could make the ocean itself feel unsafe. The Admiral Graf Spee became the most celebrated of these raiders, and her story became the first great naval narrative of the Second World War, a story with the compressed, dramatic shape of a short film. She had been cruising the South Atlantic and Indian Ocean, sinking merchant ships with methodical precision, carefully avoiding warships, and operating with a level of discipline that her British hunters came to reluctantly admire. Her captain, Hans Langsdorff, was known for treating the crews of captured vessels with a consideration unusual in wartime, maintaining their ships until he was ready to sink them, ensuring the survival of their personnel, attempting to conduct commerce warfare within what he understood to be the laws of naval engagement. He was, by the accounts of those who encountered him, a man of personal dignity operating inside a conflict that was daily eroding the space for such qualities. On the 13th of December, 1939, the Graf Spee encountered 3 British cruisers in the waters off the South American coast: HMS Exeter, HMS Ajax, and HMS Achilles. What followed was the Battle of the River Plate, a running engagement that lasted the better part of a morning. The Graf Spee was more powerful than any one of the 3 British ships individually, but the 3 of them together were able to divide her gunfire and coordinate their attacks in a way that absorbed her firepower advantage. Exeter was seriously damaged. Ajax and Achilles took hits, but the Graf Spee herself was struck multiple times, damaging fuel systems and other critical equipment. Langsdorff made the decision to put into the neutral port of Montevideo in Uruguay for emergency repairs. What followed was a masterpiece of British psychological warfare conducted under enormous diplomatic and time pressure. The British knew their ships were not in condition to fight another immediate engagement with the Graf Spee. Their priority was to prevent her from leaving port before reinforcements arrived. So they fed the Uruguayan government intelligence, some accurate, some embellished, suggesting that a powerful British naval force was assembling just beyond the territorial limit. Langsdorff, convinced he faced impossible odds and unwilling to sacrifice his crew in a fight he believed he could not survive, made a decision that shocked Berlin and astonished the watching world. On the 17th of December, 1939, he took the Graf Spee out into the estuary of the River Plate and scuttled her. 3 days later, he took his own life. The scuttling of the Graf Spee was a profound moment for the Kriegsmarine, though not in the way that simple accounts often suggest. It was not merely a defeat. It was the first demonstration of an institutional dilemma that would haunt German naval command throughout the war: the tension between tactical preservation and strategic commitment. German capital ships were too few and too precious to risk in straight fights with superior forces, and yet commerce raiding required exactly that kind of presence in contested waters. The pocket battleships could threaten Allied shipping effectively only by exposing themselves to Allied warships. And when that exposure came, the calculation of how much risk was acceptable became nearly impossible to navigate consistently. Back in the North Sea and Baltic, the Kriegsmarine was engaged in a different kind of war: the careful, grinding business of mine laying, coastal patrol, and the protection of German trade routes in the Baltic. These were unglamorous duties, rarely recorded in the historical accounts that focus on great ship engagements and submarine aces. But they mattered enormously to the German war economy, which depended on the uninterrupted flow of Swedish iron ore southward through Norwegian and Baltic waters. Without that iron ore, German steel production would falter. Without German steel, the entire war machine, tanks, aircraft, artillery, ships would slow and eventually stop. The Kriegsmarine's Baltic operations, quiet and technically demanding, were the logistical spine of German rearmament and war production in those first years. The Deutschland, renamed Lutzow in early 1940 to avoid the propaganda disaster of a ship named after Germany being sunk, operated as a commerce raider with more limited results than the Graf Spee. The Admiral Scheer would have a more successful career later in the war, conducting a lengthy raiding voyage in 1940 and 1941 that accounted for substantial Allied shipping. But these individual achievements, however genuine, were always operating against the background constraint of what surface ships could reasonably accomplish in a maritime environment that was tilting, month by month, toward Allied advantage. The pocket battleships had been clever concepts, designed for a specific strategic purpose. The problem was that the war they were designed to fight a limited naval conflict with a Britain that preferred accommodation to confrontation bore little resemblance to the war that had actually begun. In Berlin, Raeder watched the ocean campaign with a mixture of satisfaction at individual successes and growing unease about structural vulnerabilities. He was a man of enormous personal control and institutional confidence, but he was not blind. He could read the logistical equations as clearly as anyone. The Kriegsmarine's surface raiders needed support ships, tankers, and supply vessels prepositioned across the Atlantic to sustain their operations at range. Building and maintaining that support network required coordination, secrecy, and a certain amount of good fortune. As Allied intelligence improved and Allied maritime reach expanded, the support network became increasingly difficult to protect. Ships that had been reliably resupplying German raiders in remote ocean positions were being found and destroyed, one by one, with a regularity that suggested the British had found a way into the German operational communications. They had, but that is a story for a later chapter. The autumn and winter of 1939 and the spring of 1940 were, for the Kriegsmarine, a period of operational activity that was broadly more successful than its pre-war skeptics had predicted, and yet still fundamentally inadequate relative to what a maritime war of this scale required. The pocket battleships had proven capable of causing real damage and considerable disruption to Allied shipping. The submarine force was beginning its work in the Atlantic and finding convoys vulnerable. The surface navy had demonstrated it could operate at range, evade pursuit when necessary, and land meaningful blows against Allied trade. None of this was trivial. But against the weight of the Royal Navy, with its centuries of institutional experience, its global basing network, its intelligence advantages, and its numerical superiority in almost every vessel category, the Kriegsmarine was managing an asymmetric contest, and asymmetric contests are exhausting to sustain. Chapter 4: Norway and the Price of Ambition. The spring of 1940 brought the Kriegsmarine its most complex and costly operation, and simultaneously one of its most strategically significant contributions to the German war effort. The invasion of Norway in April of that year was a joint operation army, air force, and navy, but it was the Kriegsmarine that bore the most exposed role because it was the navy that had to carry German troops across contested waters to landing sites along the Norwegian coast, while the Royal Navy, alerted by intelligence, moved to intercept. The strategic logic behind the Norwegian operation was, from the German perspective, compelling. Norway's coastline provided the sheltered inshore route the famous leads through which Swedish iron ore was shipped southward to German ports. If Britain occupied Norway, or simply extended its naval reach sufficiently to threaten that route, the iron ore supply was at risk. The Germans estimated that roughly 11 million tons of iron ore transited through Norwegian coastal waters annually, and that this flow was non-negotiable for German industrial capacity. It was also the case that Norwegian ports and airfields, once in German hands, would dramatically extend the operating range of German naval and air forces into the North Atlantic, a strategic prize of considerable value. The decision to go was taken. The planning was aggressive and tight. The execution would be improvised. The operation began on the 9th of April, 1940, when German forces simultaneously moved against multiple Norwegian ports from Narvik in the far north to Oslo in the south. It was an extraordinarily ambitious simultaneous assault conducted across a coastline of enormous length in weather conditions that were capricious even by North Sea standards. The Kriegsmarine's role was to deliver army units to their assigned landing zones, and in some cases its ships had to enter fjords that placed them within range of Norwegian coastal artillery and crucially within range of British naval forces that were operating nearby. The risks were enormous and the German naval command knew it. The operation proceeded anyway. The fighting around Narvik demonstrated the cost of that risk most brutally. In the first engagement at Narvik, on the 10th of April, 1940, British destroyers entered the fjord and attacked the German destroyers that had delivered mountain troops to the port. 2 British destroyers were lost, but so were 2 German destroyers, and several others were damaged. 3 days later, on the 13th of April, the British returned with the battleship Warspite and a flotilla of destroyers and completed the destruction of every remaining German destroyer in the fjord. The Kriegsmarine lost 10 destroyers at Narvik, a significant fraction of its total destroyer strength in those 2 engagements. These were ships the German Navy could not easily replace, given the pace of its construction program. Further south, the losses continued. The heavy cruiser Blücher was sunk in the Oslofjord by Norwegian shore guns and torpedo batteries, a striking demonstration that even modern heavy warships were vulnerable to determined coastal defenders operating in confined waters. The cruiser Karlsruhe was sunk by a British submarine shortly after delivering troops to Kristiansand. The cruiser Königsberg was sunk by British aircraft, becoming the first major warship in history to be sunk by aircraft in wartime conditions, a precedent whose implications for the future of surface naval warfare would only become fully apparent over the following years. The toll mounted with a severity that, had the operation not ultimately succeeded in its strategic objective, might have been categorized as catastrophic. But the operation did succeed, in the strategic sense that matters most. Norway fell to German occupation. The iron ore route was secured. The coastal bases became available for German submarine and aircraft operations. And the Kriegsmarine, for all its losses, had demonstrated something that surprised even its own commanders. It could project power at range, conduct complex joint operations, and hold its nerve under fire even when taking serious punishment. The army units had been delivered, the mission had been accomplished, the price had been high, but the prize was real. What the Norwegian campaign revealed about the Kriegsmarine was not simply its courage or its technical capability. It revealed the fundamental tension at the heart of German naval strategy. The Kriegsmarine was an instrument designed for a specific strategic purpose, threatening and attacking British sea communications, but it kept being diverted into supporting ground operations that consumed ships it could not replace. Norway cost destroyers that were needed in the Atlantic. The ships sunk or damaged in the fjords were not rebuilt in time to matter. Raeder understood this, and it added to his growing private frustration with Hitler's insistence on using the Navy as a support service for army operations rather than as an independent strategic instrument. The argument would recur throughout the war, growing more pointed as the losses accumulated and the replacements failed to keep pace. By the summer of 1940, with France having fallen and Britain standing alone, the Kriegsmarine faced a decision of enormous historical consequence. Hitler was contemplating an invasion of Britain, Operation Sea Lion, and Raeder was asked to assess its naval feasibility. His answer was essentially that it was not feasible, not with the naval forces currently available, not against a Royal Navy that was intact and defending home waters, and not across the English Channel, which his remaining destroyers could not adequately protect. He needed air supremacy over the crossing route, he needed more landing craft than Germany currently possessed, and he needed time he was not going to be given. The Luftwaffe failed to achieve air supremacy in the Battle of Britain that summer. Sea Lion was quietly shelved. The invasion of Britain never came. But the shelving of Sea Lion did not reduce the strategic importance of the maritime contest. If Britain could not be invaded, it could perhaps be starved. It could be isolated. It could be cut off from the American food, fuel, and material that was sustaining its war effort. This was Donitz's argument, advanced with renewed urgency in the autumn and winter of 1940. The mathematics were not complicated in their basic outline. Britain imported the majority of its food and almost all of its oil. If German submarines could sink merchant ships faster than Allied shipyards could build them, the arithmetic would eventually favor Germany. The question was whether there were enough submarines to do the work, and whether time remained before American industrial capacity shifted the balance irrevocably. Dönitz believed the window existed. He pressed for every submarine that could be built, crewed, and sent to sea. The war beneath the waves was about to enter its most intense phase. The summer and autumn of 1940 became known, from the German perspective, as the first happy time, a grim label applied to a period when submarines operated with startling effectiveness against Allied convoys that were inadequately escorted and incompletely defended. The mathematics of those months were severe. Convoys crossing the North Atlantic encountered wolf packs that struck at night on the surface, where ASDIC sonar was largely ineffective, disappeared before dawn, and regrouped for the next attack. The convoys had too few escort ships. The aircraft that might have provided overhead protection could not yet reach the mid-Atlantic gap where the worst of the fighting took place. And Allied convoy routing, while improving, had not yet achieved the level of intelligence and coordination it would later deploy with devastating effect. For those months, the sea belonged to the submarines, and Dönitz watched the tonnage figures accumulate with a professional satisfaction and a strategist's mounting certainty that the campaign was winnable. Chapter 5. The Bismarck. There are ships that become legends not because of their careers, which may be long and ordinary, but because of the manner in which they end. The Bismarck had one of the shortest combat careers in the history of large warships. Less than 2 weeks from departure to sinking. And yet the name Bismarck became one of the most recognized in the entire naval history of the Second World War. Not because of what she accomplished, her accomplishment was a single engagement, a single sinking, but because of what her loss represented, the end of one era and the brutal clarification of a new one. She had been laid down in 1936 and launched in 1939, a product of the same shipbuilding ambition that had driven Raider's surface fleet program. She displaced 52,600 tons in full operational condition, mounted 8 15-inch guns in 4 double turrets, and could make 30 knots in good sea conditions. She was, by the engineering standards of 1941, one of the most formidable surface warships afloat. The British, who had excellent intelligence on her specifications even before she was operational, took her seriously as a threat, not because she could win a fleet engagement against the Royal Navy in home waters, but because if she reached the open Atlantic, she could conduct commerce raiding on a scale that would make the pocket battleship campaign look modest by comparison. The operation designated Rhine exercise, the Bismarck's operational debut, departed the Baltic in the 3rd week of May, 1941, with the Bismarck accompanied by the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen. The plan was to break out into the North Atlantic through the Denmark Strait between Iceland and Greenland, evade the Royal Navy's Northern Patrol, and then operate against Allied convoys with the combination of the Bismarck's firepower and the Prinz Eugen's speed and range. Raider hoped that a successful commerce raiding cruise by his most powerful surface unit would demonstrate the continued relevance and effectiveness of the surface fleet in the face of Dönitz's persistent advocacy for the fond submarines. The operation was also a matter of institutional prestige, and Raider understood it in those terms. On the 24th of May, 1941, in the Denmark Strait, the 2 German ships encountered a British force consisting of HMS Hood and HMS Prince of Wales. HMS Hood was at that moment the largest warship in the Royal Navy, a battle cruiser of enormous prestige, the symbol of British naval power, a ship known around the world. The engagement that followed lasted only a matter of minutes. The Hood was struck by large caliber shells, and the resulting explosion tore the ship apart. She sank in a matter of minutes, taking more than 1,400 men with her. Only 3 men survived. The news of the Hood's loss sent a shock through Britain that was not merely strategic, but deeply emotional, the loss of a symbol as much as a warship. The Bismarck had scored the most spectacular single achievement of German surface naval warfare in the entire conflict. But the engagement had not been without cost. The Prince of Wales had landed several hits on the Bismarck that damaged fuel tanks and caused oil leaking, reducing the ship's operational range and forcing a change in plans. The Prinz Eugen was detached to operate independently. The Bismarck turned toward the French port of Saint-Nazaire for repairs, and the Royal Navy, stung and enraged by the loss of the Hood, mobilized every available ship in the North Atlantic to find and intercept her. What followed over the next 3 days was one of the most intense naval pursuits in maritime history, a sweep of the North Atlantic by British warships and aircraft, searching for a single ship. The Bismarck was tracked, lost, found again, and ultimately damaged by a torpedo from a Swordfish aircraft launched from HMS Ark Royal on the evening of the 26th of May, 1941. The torpedo struck her stern and jammed her rudder, leaving the Bismarck unable to steer a course that would bring her within reach of the French coast. She circled, damaged and unable to control her course, through the night. On the morning of the 27th of May, 1941, the British battleships King George V and Rodney found the Bismarck and engaged her in what could only be called a one-sided punishment. The Bismarck's steering was destroyed. Her guns fell silent one by one. For approximately an hour, she absorbed a continuous bombardment without being able to respond effectively. The ship that had been the pride of the Kriegsmarine surface fleet program was reduced, in that hour, to a burning, listing hull. She sank later that morning. After the cruiser Dorsetshire fired 3 torpedoes into her, more than 2,000 men went down with her. A handful of survivors were recovered. The loss of the Bismarck was felt throughout the Kriegsmarine at every level, but its most significant effect was strategic rather than emotional. Hitler, who had watched the operation with the anxiety of a man who had always been more comfortable with land forces, drew the lesson that large surface ships were too valuable and too vulnerable to be risked in open ocean operations without a clear and overwhelming operational advantage. He ordered a more cautious posture for the remaining heavy surface units. Raeder objected, argued, and was overruled. The era of German surface raiding in the open Atlantic was, for practical purposes, over. The Bismarck had been the last serious attempt to make that strategy work. Her loss foreclosed it. What replaced the surface fleet strategy was not a decision made in a single meeting or recorded in a single document. It was a gradual, reluctant, institution-wide acknowledgement that the future of German naval warfare lay beneath the surface rather than upon it. Dönitz, who had been arguing this point since before the war began, watched events unfold with the controlled frustration of a man who has been right for years and has spent those years being only partially believed. His submarines were already at sea, already accumulating their extraordinary tonnage figures, already demonstrating the brutal logic of attrition warfare. But they were still not receiving the resources he believed the campaign required. The Bismarck's loss, paradoxically, was the event that began to shift that resource calculation, not by a dramatic reallocation, but by the slow withdrawal of political faith in the surface alternative. The Bismarck story entered German public consciousness differently than it entered British public consciousness. In Britain, the sinking of the Hood was a wound, and the subsequent destruction of the Bismarck was its answer, a demonstration that the Royal Navy could absorb a catastrophic blow and respond within days with overwhelming force. In Germany, the Bismarck was mourned as a ship whose potential had been destroyed before it could be fully expressed, a reading that was, in its own way, a form of institutional consolation for an institution that had begun to sense the depth of the challenge it faced. Chapter 6. The Wolfpacks gather. By the winter of 1941 and into 1942, the centre of gravity of the naval war had shifted decisively beneath the surface. The great surface ship operations were becoming less frequent, more carefully constrained, and less strategically ambitious. But beneath the Atlantic, Dönitz's submarines were operating with an intensity and effectiveness that the Allied convoy system had not yet found a reliable answer to. This was the era of the Wolfpack, a tactical innovation so elegantly simple in concept and so devastatingly effective in execution that it forced the entire Allied maritime establishment to rethink its defensive approach from first principles. The Wolfpack, or Rudeltaktik as the Germans called it, was not a complicated idea. When a submarine made contact with an Allied convoy, that submarine designated the shadower did not attack immediately. Instead, it maintained contact, staying beyond visual range, transmitting the convoy's position, course, and speed to Dönitz's headquarters ashore. Dönitz, directing operations from a command center rather than from a ship at sea, an unusual and in some ways revolutionary form of tactical command, would then vector every available submarine in the region toward the convoy's projected track. When enough submarines had assembled, the signal to attack was given. The attack came at night, on the surface, from multiple directions simultaneously. The logic of the night surface attack was sound, and its effectiveness was immediately apparent. Allied anti-submarine defense in this period depended primarily on ASDIC, a sonar system that transmitted sound pulses through the water and detected returning echoes from submerged hulls. A submarine on the surface was not a submarine acoustically, it was a surface contact, and ASDIC was not designed to detect surface contacts in the same way. A small submarine at night, with a low silhouette and no smoke, was extraordinarily difficult to see from an escort ship's bridge. The escort might know a Wolfpack was nearby. It could not necessarily see it. And while it was searching for one contact, another submarine was attacking from a different bearing. The individual submarine commanders who executed these attacks were given considerable tactical freedom once the signal came to engage. Some, like Otto Kretschmer, who became one of the most successful submarine commanders of the entire war, preferred to drive directly into the middle of a convoy and engage ships individually at close range, a tactic of breathtaking audacity that exploited the confusion and the difficulty of fire control in those conditions. Others preferred to remain at longer range and fire spreads of torpedoes into the columns of merchant ships, relying on the geometry of a densely packed convoy to ensure that not every shot missed. Different styles, same mathematics. Merchant ships going down, cargoes going to the ocean floor, crews struggling in cold water. The human cost aboard the merchant vessels was severe and is often under-acknowledged in the accounts that focus on tactical doctrine and tonnage statistics. The men sailing those ships were not combatants in the conventional sense. They were merchant sailors, men who had gone to sea before the war began, who had signed on for ordinary commercial voyages, who now found themselves crossing the North Atlantic in the knowledge that submarines were waiting somewhere on the route. They could not fight back in any meaningful sense. They could only maintain their position in the convoy formation, keep steam up, follow orders, and hope. When the torpedoes came, they came without warning, a sudden concussion, the ship lurching, machinery failing, lights going out, and then the awful question of how long the vessel would stay afloat and whether the lifeboats could be launched in time. Dönitz tracked his campaign through the cold language of tonnage statistics. He believed correctly, as a matter of arithmetic, that if his submarines could sink Allied merchant shipping at a rate faster than Allied shipyards could replace it, Britain would eventually be forced to reduce the scale of its military operations or seek terms. The numbers from the first happy time of 1940 and the second happy time that began after the United States entered the war in December 1941 were, from the German perspective, encouraging. Monthly tonnage figures climbed. The mid-Atlantic gap, the zone beyond the reach of land-based aircraft from either side, was a killing ground in the most literal sense. Convoys entering the gap with their escorts faced hours of exposure with no overhead protection. The entry of the United States into the war in December 1941 opened an extraordinary and, for the Allies, catastrophically mismanaged episode on the American eastern seaboard. American coastal shipping, city lights still blazing on shore, ships sailing independently without convoy protection, provided Dönitz's submarines with a period of operation so productive that German submariners called it the second happy time or, more grimly, the American shooting season. The US Navy had been given months of warning, through observation of what had worked and failed in the British Atlantic, and had not fully implemented convoy procedures along the American coast. The result was a period of merchant ship losses along the eastern seaboard that was, in tonnage terms, as severe as the worst months of the North Atlantic campaign. The lesson that merchant ships sailing independently were far more vulnerable than ships sailing in organized convoys with escort was one that should not have needed to be learnt again, and yet it was. Throughout this period, Dönitz maintained his headquarters ashore and directed Wolfpack operations through a centralized command structure that was, in its concept, genuinely innovative. He believed in the principle of concentrated force that the way to defeat a convoy system was to overwhelm the escorts, not to pick at the margins. He also believed in continuous pressure, that the way to prevent the Allies from adapting their defensive arrangements was to keep the tempo of operations high enough that adaptations could not be stabilized before the next wave of pressure arrived. He was pursuing a strategic theory as well as a tactical campaign, and for a period of approximately 2 years, the theory produced results that came closer to the strategic objective than any other element of the German war effort in the maritime sphere. The men who crewed the submarines during this period became celebrated figures in Germany, names printed in the national press, faces photographed, careers tracked by a public that needed heroes. The ace submariners of the Kriegsmarine occupied a position in German public consciousness similar to the fighter aces of the Luftwaffe individuals whose personal achievements stood as evidence that the war was, at some fundamental level, still winnable. Kretschmer, Prien, Shepke. These were the names that appeared on the front pages. They were not merely naval officers. They were symbols of an institutional culture that believed in aggressive individual initiative within a coordinated strategic framework. The culture was real, and in the right conditions, it was formidable. But underneath the victory statistics and the public celebrations, the structural pressures on the U-boat campaign were already beginning to build. The British were improving their convoy escort capabilities. New ships were entering service. Aircraft coverage was being extended. Most importantly, though, this would not become publicly visible for some time. British intelligence was making extraordinary progress against the German naval cipher system. The Enigma machine, which encrypted German naval communications including Dönitz's operational orders to his wolf packs, was being gradually penetrated by the analysts at Bletchley Park. Not completely, not consistently, but enough, on critical occasions, to allow Allied convoy routing to be adjusted away from concentrations of waiting submarines. The mathematics of the campaign were still running in Germany's favour in the winter of 1941 and into 1942, but the factors that would eventually reverse those mathematics were already in motion, invisible, patient, and as dangerous to the wolf packs as any depth charge or aircraft. The ocean does not announce when the balance shifts. It does not change colour or sound a tone. The water looked the same in the autumn of 1942 as it had in the autumn of 1940. The same grey swells, the same grey skies, the same cold. But beneath that unchanged surface, the calculations of advantage were slowly, quietly rewriting themselves. The wolf packs would continue. The tonnage would continue to accumulate. The men would continue to sail on both sides into waters that offered no guarantees. But the window that Dönitz had identified, the window in which the submarine campaign could achieve its strategic objective before Allied industrial power and intelligence capability overwhelmed it, was closing. Not yet visibly, not yet decisively, but it was closing, one convoy at a time. Chapter 7. The Turn of the Tide. There is a moment in any prolonged contest when the momentum shifts not with a single dramatic event, but with an accumulation of quiet reversals so gradual that neither side can name the exact hour when advantage changed hands. For the Kriegsmarine's submarine campaign, that moment arrived somewhere in the long months between the summer of 1942 and the spring of 1943. From the outside, the campaign still looked formidable. Monthly sinking figures were high. New submarines were commissioning regularly. Dönitz had more boats at sea than at any previous point in the war. But beneath those surface statistics, the structural foundations of Allied countermeasure were strengthening with a consistency and momentum that would, within months, produce the most decisive reversal in the entire history of the Battle of the Atlantic. The technological race that underpinned the submarine war is one of the least cinematic but most consequential stories of the Second World War. It was fought in laboratories and engineering workshops, in signals analysis rooms and prototype testing facilities, by men and women whose names never appeared in national newspapers, but whose work shaped the outcome of the maritime campaign more decisively than any individual commander at sea. On the Allied side, the development of improved radar systems, particularly centimetric radar, operating at wavelengths so short that the German detection equipment could not pick them up, gave escort ships and maritime patrol aircraft a critical new capability. They could now find submarines on the surface at night, in the dark, without warning, at ranges that made escape difficult and evasion nearly impossible. The submarines that had relied on night surface attacks for their core tactical advantage suddenly found that advantage stripped away without understanding why. The Lee Light, fitted to RAF Coastal Command aircraft, compounded this problem. A powerful airborne searchlight activated at close range during the final phase of an attack run. It allowed aircraft to illuminate a surface submarine just as the attack was delivered, removing the darkness that the submarines had relied upon as their primary camouflage during night operations. Submarine crews began reporting encounters with aircraft that seemed to appear from nowhere, at altitudes and approach angles that gave no warning. Aircraft were finding submarines that the submarines could not detect until the bombs were already falling. The psychological effect on crews who had been trained to believe that night surface operations were relatively safe was profound and lasting. The ocean that had been their hunting ground was becoming something else, something uncertain, surveilled, and dangerous in ways that standard training had not prepared them for. Meanwhile, the Allied convoy escort forces were growing both in numbers and in tactical sophistication. The construction programs in American, British, and Canadian shipyards were producing escort vessels, destroyers, corvettes, destroyer escorts at rates that the German naval intelligence had consistently underestimated. The escort groups were being organized into permanent units that trained together, developed shared tactical procedures, and accumulated institutional experience about how to find and prosecute submarines in a coordinated way. Where a convoy in 1940 might have had 3 or 4 escorts, a convoy in 1943 might have 8 or more, supported by long-range aircraft and in some cases by an escort carrier, a small aircraft carrier dedicated to convoy protection that placed air coverage directly over the convoy rather than relying on land-based patrol. The mid-Atlantic gap, that stretch of ocean beyond the reach of land-based aircraft from either side where the wolf packs had operated with relative freedom, began to shrink from both edges as very long-range aircraft were allocated to the Atlantic campaign, and as escort carriers entered service, the gap had never been an intentional Allied vulnerability. It had been a consequence of limited aviation range and insufficient aircraft numbers. As both constraints eased, the gap narrowed. By the spring of 1943, it had effectively closed over the convoy routes that mattered most. The wolf packs that had moved through the mid-Atlantic with confidence now found that every position along the convoy routes could potentially be covered by aircraft that they could not reliably detect or evade. The intelligence dimension of this struggle was perhaps the most asymmetric of all the advantages the Allies were accumulating. Bletchley Park's analysts had, through extraordinary intellectual effort and considerable operational risk, achieved a degree of penetration into the German naval enigma cipher that allowed them, on many occasions, to read Dönitz's operational orders before the submarines that received them had time to act. The intelligence was not perfect, not continuous, and not without interruptions. There were periods when the cipher settings changed, or when operational security on the German side temporarily obscured the picture. But when it worked, the intelligence it provided was of a quality that no human intelligence network could have matched. Convoy routing staff could direct convoys away from Wolfpack patrol lines. Submarines would arrive at assigned positions to find empty ocean. Dönitz watched his carefully positioned patrol lines miss convoy after convoy and understood that something had gone wrong with the mathematics of the campaign, but could not identify the cause with certainty. He suspected compromised communications. His technical advisors told him that the Enigma system was mathematically unbreakable. They were not wrong in theory. The system's security rested on genuinely sound cryptographic principles. What they had not fully accounted for was the combination of captured material, procedural lapses, crib exploitation, and computing machinery that the Bletchley analysts were applying against it with tireless ingenuity. The gap between what the system's designers believed about its security and what Allied cryptanalysts were actually achieving was one of the defining information asymmetries of the war. Dönitz operated in the belief that his communications were secure. He was wrong, and the consequences of that error accumulated in the tonnage figures on both sides of the Atlantic ledger throughout 1942 and into 1943. The winter convoy battles of early 1943 were the climax of the Wolfpack campaign, a period of ferocious, exhausting, costly fighting that produced the largest convoy battles of the entire war. Convoys crossing the North Atlantic in those months ran the length of the Wolfpack patrol lines, losing ships daily, with escort commanders making constant decisions about how to balance the protection of the convoy against the pursuit and destruction of attacking submarines. The losses on both sides were severe. Merchant ships went down, but submarines were also being sunk at rates that Dönitz found deeply alarming, not the occasional loss that could be absorbed by a healthy production program, but losses that were beginning to approach the replacement rate, then reach it, then threaten to exceed it. Young men who had trained for months were dying on their first or second patrol, The experience base of the submarine arm was eroding in ways that no personnel program could quickly repair. The month of May 1943 became the defining moment of the campaign's reversal. It was not a battle or a specific event, it was a month of accumulated results so severe that Dönitz, reviewing his own statistics with a commander's brutal honesty, was forced to acknowledge that the campaign as currently constituted could not continue at its current cost. In that single month, the Kriegsmarine lost more than 40 submarines, a catastrophic figure against a backdrop of earlier monthly losses of perhaps 4 to 6. The escort groups and long-range aircraft over the convoy routes had found a rhythm, a method, a combination of detection and prosecution that the submarines could not reliably counter. The wolf packs were being broken up before they could assemble. Individual submarines were being found and destroyed with a consistency that suggested the Allied anti-submarine forces had achieved a fundamental qualitative advantage, not merely a temporary tactical one. Dönitz ordered his submarines to temporarily withdraw from the North Atlantic convoy routes in May 1943, an event that historians have called, without exaggeration, the turning point of the Battle of the Atlantic. He had not given up. He believed that new technologies, new tactics, and new submarine designs could restore the campaign's effectiveness. He was partly right about the technologies. There were genuine improvements coming, including improved radar warning receivers, acoustic torpedoes, and eventually the snorkel breathing mast that allowed submarines to run their diesel engines while submerged. But partly right was not enough. The withdrawal of May 1943 was an acknowledgement that the campaign had reached a critical juncture, a juncture from which it never fully recovered. The ocean that had been the Wolfpack's greatest asset had become, in the course of 3 years, the greatest argument against them. Chapter 8. Operation Drumbeat and the American Sea. The story of the Kriegsmarine submarine campaign has a chapter that takes place not in the grey North Atlantic, but along the lit coastlines and warm shipping lanes of the American eastern seaboard, a chapter whose details, when examined honestly, reflect one of the most significant failures of maritime preparation in American naval history. It is a chapter about opportunity recognized and exploited on one side, and institutional complacency meeting horrifying consequence on the other. It is not a comfortable story, but it is an important one, and its geography and timeline place it at the heart of the war's middle period. When the United States entered the war following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Dönitz moved with a speed that reflected both his understanding of the opportunity and his frustration at the constraints that had limited his operations to date. He had been watching American coastal shipping lanes for months, noting the patterns, calculating the distances, and planning what he would do the moment the operational situation permitted. The moment arrived in January 1942, when he dispatched his first group of submarines, initially just 5, because that was all that was available at the required range toward the American eastern seaboard in an operation he designated Paukenschlag, which translates approximately as drum beat or drum roll. The results were extraordinary. American shipping along the eastern seaboard was operating almost entirely without the protection of a convoy system. Ships were sailing independently, following regular predictable routes, broadcasting radio signals that made their positions identifiable, and silhouetting themselves against the still-lit skyline of American coastal cities whose lights had not been dimmed. The concept of a blackout, the simple measure of reducing shore-based lighting to prevent surface submarines from using the illuminated coast as a background against which to spot ships, had been resisted by American resort communities and local authorities who feared the economic impact on tourism and commerce. The consequence of this resistance was visible in the silhouettes of merchant ships dark against lit shores, making them targets of almost shocking ease for submarine commanders who had spent the previous 2 years hunting in the blackout conditions of the North Atlantic. Submarine commanders operating along the American coast during those early months of 1942 described conditions that were, in their tactical difficulty, closer to peacetime exercises than to combat patrols in a contested ocean. Ships were sighted regularly. Attacks could be made at close range against unhurried, unescorted targets with no coordinating escort to prosecute the attacking submarine afterward. The rate of sinkings per submarine patrol day, the standard efficiency metric, reached levels during this period that exceeded even the first happy time of 1940 in the North Atlantic. It was, by the cold mathematics of the campaign, the most productive period in the entire history of the German submarine arm. The human cost on the Allied side was staggering and largely invisible to the American public at the time. Merchant ships burning within sight of the Florida and North Carolina shorelines, their crews struggling in water illuminated by the fires of their own vessels, created scenes that were occasionally witnessed by civilians on beaches who had no framework for understanding what they were seeing. Bodies and oil slicks washed onto tourist beaches. Local newspapers were discouraged from reporting what was happening. The deliberate management of public information about the losses along the American coast meant that the scale of the catastrophe unfolding in those waters was not fully appreciated by the American population while it was occurring. The losses were real, running into hundreds of ships and millions of tons of cargo over the first months of 1942, but their psychological weight fell primarily on the men who sailed and died in those waters. The U.S. Navy's Admiral Ernest King, who commanded American naval forces, was not a man who accepted criticism graciously, and his response to British suggestions that the US adopt convoy procedures immediately was coloured by institutional pride and genuine logistical constraint in roughly equal measure. The United States Navy did not have enough escort ships to protect convoys along the full length of the eastern seaboard from the beginning. That was a real limitation. But the decision to delay convoy implementation while ships were being built, rather than immediately grouping vulnerable ships into defended convoys, even with inadequate escorts, which British experience suggested was dramatically better than sailing independently, was a decision whose cost in ships and lives was severe. When the convoy system was finally properly implemented along the American coast by the summer of 1942, the sinking rate fell dramatically and immediately. The lesson that convoys worked was not new. It had been proven in the First World War and demonstrated repeatedly in the North Atlantic. Its delayed application along the American coast was one of the more preventable tragedies of the maritime war. The Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico offered a second productive hunting ground for German submarines during the first half of 1942. The oil tanker traffic from Venezuelan and Caribbean refineries to the American East Coast and thence to Britain was critically important to Allied fuel supply. Tankers, large and slow and carrying enormously flammable cargo, were among the most valuable and, in some respects, the most vulnerable of all merchant vessel types. A torpedo hit on a loaded tanker could produce fires visible for miles, and the cargo itself added an additional dimension of catastrophe to what was already a severe threat. German submarines operating in the Caribbean during this period found tanker traffic that was, for a time, almost as poorly defended as the eastern seaboard traffic, and they exploited the situation with the same methodical efficiency. Dönitz understood that the American shooting season, as his crews came to call it, could not last indefinitely. The American industrial machine, once engaged, would produce escort ships, aircraft, and improved defensive systems at rates that would close the window within months. His objective was to extract maximum strategic value from the opportunity before that closure occurred. He succeeded, in the sense that the losses inflicted during this period were real and significant. But whether those losses actually shifted the strategic balance in Germany's favour, whether the ships and cargo sunk were of sufficient magnitude to genuinely constrain Allied operational capacity, rather than merely impose a costly delay, is a more complicated question. Allied shipbuilding, particularly in American yards, was accelerating at a pace that Dönitz's planners had consistently underestimated. The ships being sunk were real losses. They were also, increasingly, being replaced. The submarines that conducted these operations were, by the middle period of the war, the Type 7C, the standard Atlantic submarine that formed the backbone of the Kriegsmarine's underwater force. It was approximately 67 meters in length, displacing around 769 tons on the surface, crewed by around 50 men, and capable of carrying 14 torpedoes on operational patrol. Its range and endurance made it suitable for extended Atlantic operations, but not comfortably so. Crew living conditions were extraordinarily austere, with every square centimetre of space occupied by equipment, weapons, or stored provisions. The smell, the noise, the physical confinement, the alternation between exhausting watchkeeping and disrupted sleep, these were the daily conditions of men who had chosen submarine service voluntarily. Their psychological resilience, whatever one thinks of the cause they served, was not in question. The return of submarines from successful patrols along the American coast to their bases in the French Atlantic ports, Lorient, Brest, Saint-Nazaire, La Rochelle, Bordeaux was a moment of release that has been described in surviving crew accounts as something close to physical relief. The massive reinforced concrete submarine pens that the organization Todt had constructed at these ports were among the most impressive engineering works of the German military program structures so massively built, with roof thicknesses measured in multiple meters of reinforced concrete, that Allied bombing campaigns never successfully penetrated them from above. The submarines sheltering inside were safe from aerial attack in a way that their bases in Germany could not have provided. The French Atlantic coast, acquired through the fall of France in 1940, had given the Kriegsmarine a strategic asset of the first order, one that extended submarine range into the Atlantic significantly compared to the North Sea bases that would otherwise have been required. The importance of those French bases to the submarine campaign was not a detail. It was a foundational condition of the campaign's viability. Chapter 9. The Tirpitz and the Fleet in Being. While the submarine campaign was reaching its climax in the North Atlantic, the Kriegsmarine's remaining heavy surface ships were playing a different kind of strategic role, one that was, by almost any conventional military measure, paradoxical. The greatest surface warship in the German fleet was spending the war in a Norwegian fjord, largely stationary, consuming enormous resources in personnel, fuel and maintenance, while conducting almost no offensive operations. And yet she was, by the assessment of the Allied command, one of the most threatening forces in the European theatre. Her name was Tirpitz, and she was the sister ship of the Bismarck, and in the history of the Second World War, there are few examples of a single ship exerting so much strategic influence through the threat of what she might do, rather than through anything she actually did. The Tirpitz had been laid down in 1936 and commissioned in February of 1941, a year behind her sister Bismarck, completing just in time to watch the Bismarck depart on her fatal patrol and never return. She shared the Bismarck's fundamental specifications: enormous displacement, 8 15-inch guns, a speed of around 30 knots, and she shared the fundamental dilemma that the Bismarck's fate had clarified. She was too valuable to risk in open ocean operations against a Royal Navy that had demonstrated it would mobilize its entire available strength to hunt down and destroy a German capital ship operating in the Atlantic. She could not safely operate in the Atlantic. She could not safely remain in German home waters where she was vulnerable to British bombing. The solution chosen was Norway, specifically the deeply sheltered fjords of the Norwegian coast, where the surrounding mountains provided natural protection from low-level air attack, where the water was deep enough to accommodate her draft, and where her mere presence created a strategic problem for the Allies that consumed far more Allied resources than the Tirpitz herself represented. The problem she created was the Arctic convoy route. Britain and its allies had committed, from the autumn of 1941, to supplying the Soviet Union with war material through the Arctic sea lanes, a route that ran from Iceland and Scotland northward around the tip of Norway, and then eastward to the Soviet ports of Murmansk and Archangel. The convoys that ran this route did so in conditions of extraordinary harshness: Arctic temperatures, pack ice, perpetual daylight in summer and perpetual darkness in winter, and constant exposure to German air attack from Norwegian airfields. The convoys were also exposed to the theoretical threat of attack by German surface forces operating from Norwegian fjords. And the Tirpitz was there, at the head of a surface force that also at various times included the pocket battleship Admiral Scheer, the heavy cruisers Hipper and Lutzow, and the battle cruiser Scharnhorst. The effect of the Tirpitz's presence on British strategic planning was disproportionate to her actual activity. Churchill described her, with uncharacteristic directness, as the beast that held down the British fleet, a single ship whose existence required the Royal Navy to maintain heavy units in home waters to counter her, rather than deploying those units to the Pacific or Mediterranean where they were also needed. To deal with the possibility that the Tirpitz might sortie into the Atlantic, the British maintained battleships at Scapa Flow that could otherwise have served elsewhere. To prevent her from attacking Arctic convoys, the British had to escort those convoys with heavy units that included cruisers and, on occasion, battleships. One ship, largely stationary in a Norwegian fjord, was shaping British naval deployments across multiple theatres. This was the doctrine of the fleet, in being the idea that a powerful naval force exerts strategic influence not only through what it does, but through what it forces the enemy to prepare for operating with a quiet, persistent effectiveness that no amount of combat activity could have replicated. The single most dramatic consequence of the Tirpitz's presence for the Arctic convoys came in the summer of 1942, with the convoy designated PQ-17. Intelligence reached the Allied Naval Command that the Tirpitz, the Admiral Scheer, and the Admiral Hipper had put to sea from their Norwegian bases, apparently preparing to attack the convoy. The First Sea Lord, Admiral Dudley Pound, facing intelligence that was incomplete and time that did not exist for extended analysis, made the decision to scatter the convoy, ordering the merchant ships to disperse and make their individual ways to Soviet ports without their naval escort. The reasoning was that if the German surface force attacked a concentrated convoy, the losses could be catastrophic in a single engagement. Scattered ships, while individually vulnerable, might at least offer a chance of some percentage reaching their destination. The Tirpitz, along with the rest of the German surface force, had in fact turned back before engaging. Hitler's standing orders required him to be personally consulted before any heavy surface unit was committed to action against a defended convoy, and the intelligence reaching him about Allied carrier forces in the area, possibly exaggerated, possibly accurate, introduced enough uncertainty that the sortie was abandoned. The Tirpitz returned to her fjord. The convoy, scattered on the assumption that she was coming, was now spread across hundreds of miles of Arctic sea without any escort at all. German submarines and aircraft found the dispersed ships over the following days. 24 of the 35 merchant ships that had comprised PQ-17 were sunk. It remains one of the most debated convoy disasters of the entire war, and its central irony that the Tirpitz's threat caused more destruction than the Tirpitz herself could have achieved in direct combat is a precise illustration of how the fleet in being doctrine operates at its most powerful. The British attempts to destroy the Tirpitz in her fjord became an extended, costly, and eventually successful operation that stretched from 1942 through 1944. Conventional bomber attack from altitude had been tried and found ineffective against a ship moored in a narrow fjord surrounded by mountains, anti-aircraft batteries, and smoke screens that could be generated within minutes of an air raid warning. The Royal Navy's Fleet Air Arm mounted a daring attack using carrier-based aircraft in April 1944 that achieved hits and caused significant damage, temporarily taking the Tirpitz out of operational service. The most technically innovative attempt came in September 1943, when the Royal Navy deployed midget submarines designated X-craft in an extraordinary feat of navigation and courage that required the tiny vessels to be towed to Norwegian waters, released, and then navigate independently through mined fjords to reach the Tirpitz at her moorings and place explosive charges beneath her hull. The charges detonated and caused serious internal damage, keeping the Tirpitz out of operational service for months and demonstrating that even the most heavily defended anchorage was not entirely safe from determined, innovative attack. The Scharnhorst, the Tirpitz's companion in the Norwegian surface force, came to a very different end than her carefully preserved fleetmate. On the 26th of December 1943, the Scharnhorst sailed from her Norwegian base to attack the Arctic convoy WW2. The German command believed that the convoy was protected only by its usual destroyer screen, and that the Scharnhorst's firepower and speed would allow her to strike quickly and withdraw before any heavy British response could intercept. The intelligence was wrong, the assessment was wrong, and the Scharnhorst sailed into a British trap constructed around the battleship Duke of York. In the Battle of the North Cape, the Scharnhorst was intercepted, hit repeatedly by Duke of York's heavy guns, and finally finished by torpedoes from the surrounding destroyers and cruisers. She sank in freezing Arctic waters, with the loss of all but 36 of her complement of approximately 1,900 men. With the Scharnhorst gone, and the Tirpitz effectively neutralized by air and midget submarine attack, the Kriegsmarine surface force in Norway ceased to be an active operational threat. The fleet in being had become a fleet barely surviving. The final chapter of the Tirpitz came in November of 1944, when the RAF's No. 617 Squadron, flying specially modified Lancaster bombers carrying 12,000-pound tall-boy deep-penetration bombs, found the Tirpitz at her moorings off Tromsø and delivered hits that caused her to capsize. She rolled over in shallow water and lay on her side, visible from shore, visible from the air, a monument to the gap between naval ambition and strategic reality. In the years after the war, Norwegian workers cut through her hull with oxyacetylene torches and salvaged the metal, slowly dismantling what had once been one of the most feared warships in the world. Long after the war, she remained there, being reduced to nothing, as the fjord around her returned to its normal quiet. The Tirpitz had fought almost no one in battle and had still shaped the entire middle period of the war at sea. It was a strange kind of power and a strange kind of legacy. Chapter 10. The Intelligence War Beneath the Waves. There is a version of the Battle of the Atlantic that tells the story in terms of ships sunk and ships built, submarines commissioned and submarines destroyed, convoy routes shifted and patrol lines adjusted. That version is accurate as far as it goes, but it misses the dimension of the contest that was in many respects its most decisive, the war of information, interpretation, and deception that was being fought simultaneously in signals intelligence offices, in submarine headquarters on both sides, and in the minds of the small number of people on both sides who understood what was actually at stake when a signal was encrypted, transmitted, and received. The German naval communications system rested on the Enigma machine, an electromechanical cipher device that had been developed commercially in the 1920s and adopted progressively by the German military and security services through the 1930s. Its security rested on an extraordinarily large number of possible encryption settings, changed daily, which meant that even if an enemy knew the machine's mechanism, they could not read intercepted messages without knowing the specific settings in use for that day. The naval version of Enigma, which used additional rotors and more complex settings procedures than the Army or Air Force versions, was considered by the German signals security establishment to be effectively unbreakable. The belief was understandable given the mathematical reasoning behind it. It was also ultimately wrong. Bletchley Park, the British Government Code and Cipher School's wartime headquarters, located in a Victorian country house in Buckinghamshire, brought together a collection of mathematicians, linguists, chess players, crossword enthusiasts, and specialists in abstract reasoning whose combination of intellectual diversity and focused purpose was almost unprecedented in the history of intelligence work. They were operating against multiple Axis cipher systems simultaneously, and their progress against each depended on a combination of mathematical insight, captured material, procedural errors on the German side, and the application of increasingly sophisticated computing machinery, most notably the Bombi machines, developed from the pioneering work of mathematicians, including Alan Turing and Gordon Welchman. The bomb could not read Enigma directly. What it could do was eliminate vast numbers of incorrect settings rapidly, narrowing the search space to a manageable number of possibilities that human analysts could then work through to find the day's keys. The Royal Navy's contribution to this effort went beyond the analytical work at Bletchley. Intelligence from the sea captured documents, captured Enigma machines, captured rotor settings was essential to maintaining and extending the cryptanalysts' access to German naval communications. A series of operations, some planned and some improvised in the heat of existing engagements, produced captures of material that allowed the Bletchley teams to sustain and improve their access at critical moments. The capture of settings, documents, and additional equipment from a German weather ship in the North Sea in the spring of 1941 provided material of immediate operational value. Later that same year, the capture of the submarine Yuon, 10 off Iceland, provided a complete naval enigma machine with current settings, rotors, and associated documents a prize of such intelligence value that extraordinary measures were taken to conceal the fact of the capture from the German Navy, including the maintenance of absolute secrecy about the source of intelligence derived from it. The men who conducted these captures, and the men who made the analytical breakthroughs at Bletchley, fought the most consequential secret war of the entire conflict. Dönitz, on his side, was not passive about communications security. He suspected, at various points in the war, that his communications were being read, the pattern of convoy routes changing just before his patrol lines were positioned, the frequency with which submarines arrived at assigned positions to find empty ocean, the Allied response times that sometimes seemed implausibly fast, all pointed to an intelligence source of considerable quality. He ordered security reviews, he tightened procedures, he upgraded equipment. On at least one occasion, the German Naval Intelligence Evaluation concluded that there was no breach, that the suspicious patterns could be explained by coincidence and by the possibility that Allied convoy routing had become simply more sophisticated without any intelligence assist. That conclusion was wrong, but it was not carelessly reached. The Germans could not prove the breach because the Bletchley operation was being run with an operational security discipline of extraordinary quality. Sources were protected. Actionable intelligence was always given a plausible cover story. The fiction that a patrolling aircraft or surface ship had provided the sighting before it was acted upon. The deception was almost perfect, and its imperfection was not discovered in time to matter. The asymmetry of the intelligence war extended beyond enigma. British naval intelligence had developed a comprehensive picture of Kriegsmarine submarine dispositions, patrol schedules, and crew rotations through a combination of signals intelligence, human intelligence, aerial reconnaissance, and the careful aggregation of survivor testimony and wreckage analysis from ships that had been attacked. Dönitz was directing his wolf packs in the belief that his dispositions were unknown to the enemy until the moment of attack. In reality, the Allied picture of where his submarines were and where they were going was frequently detailed enough to route convoys around them. The submarines would sit at their assigned positions, waiting, and the convoys would simply not come. The wait was exhausting and demoralizing. Crews who had departed their French bases, expecting active patrols, returned after weeks at sea, having fired no torpedoes, having sighted no targets, having achieved nothing except the consumption of fuel and provisions that would have to be resupplied before the next patrol. The cryptographic war ran in both directions, though the advantage on the Allied side was significantly larger. German naval intelligence, the B-Dienst, the German radio monitoring and cryptanalysis service, had achieved significant success against British naval codes in the earlier years of the war, which was part of the reason the Wolfpacks had been so effective in the first happy time of 1940. The B-Dienst's ability to read convoy routing signals had allowed Dönitz to position his submarines in the path of convoys whose routes he knew in advance. When the British upgraded their naval codes, a process that took time and was accomplished in stages through 1942 and 1943, the B-Dienst's access declined. The Germans, who had been reading Allied communications with some success, lost that capability just as the Allies were consolidating and improving their own access to German communications. The intelligence balance tilted decisively, and the operational results followed. The effect of the intelligence war on submarine crew survival rates was severe and numerically clear. In the years when the Wolfpacks were most effective, 1940 and 1941, the losses of submarines, while real, were at levels that the training and commissioning pipeline could replace. By the second half of 1942 and through 1943, the loss rate accelerated dramatically. Submarines were being lost on their first patrols before their crews had accumulated the experience that made veteran crews so much more survivable than inexperienced ones. The average age of submarine commanders decreased as experienced officers were killed and replaced by younger men who had not yet developed the tactical intuition that kept older commanders alive in difficult engagements. The erosion of experience was compounding itself. The more veterans were lost, the faster the overall capability of the arm declined, which produced more losses, which accelerated the experience drain further. The men at Bletchley who broke the German naval codes have been called, by historians, the most important contributors to Allied victory in the Atlantic that no one could publicly recognize during the war and that almost no one knew about for decades afterward. Their work remained classified until the 1970s, when the first accounts of the ultra-intelligence program began to emerge. The submarine commanders on both sides, the convoy commodores, the escort group commanders, none of them fully understood, while it was happening, the degree to which the outcome of the Battle of the Atlantic was being shaped by people in a country house in Buckinghamshire. The ocean looked the same to everyone sailing it. The information available about that ocean was not remotely the same, and the difference between what each side knew was the difference between the war they thought they were fighting and the war that was actually occurring. The final irony of the intelligence war is that even with the clear advantage that Bletchley provided, the Battle of the Atlantic remained desperately costly for the Allies until its decisive turn in May 1943. Intelligence advantage is not a guarantee of tactical safety. Knowing where submarines are does not mean they can always be avoided or destroyed before they attack. The information helped enormously more than any other single factor. The ultra-intelligence advantage probably shortened the Atlantic campaign by a margin of months that, given how close the tonnage calculations came at certain points, may well have been strategically decisive, but it did not make the battle clean, bloodless, or mathematically certain in real time. The men at sea still died in cold water. The information war and the shooting war were two different contests, running simultaneously, each partially visible to the people conducting it, neither fully comprehensible to any individual participant. History's clarity about which factors mattered most is a luxury that no one fighting the battle could afford. Chapter 11. The Commanders in Conflict. The Kriegsmarine story is inseparable from the complicated relationship between the two men who commanded it in succession, Erich Raeder, who shaped the institution from 1928 to 1943, and Karl Dönitz, who replaced him and led it from January of 1943 to the final collapse in May 1945. They were different in almost every significant way, in background, in temperament, in strategic vision, in their relationships with Hitler, and in how history has subsequently assessed them. Understanding both men individually is necessary to understanding how the Kriegsmarine made the choices it made across 6 years of war, and why those choices produced the outcomes they did. Raeder was, in almost every respect, a man of the 19th century operating in the 20th. His formative naval experience had been shaped by the great fleet rivalry of the Wilhelmine era, when Germany and Britain had competed in capital ship construction with a directness and intensity that made naval power a measure of national greatness in the minds of both governments and publics. He had absorbed the lesson of Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz, who had designed and built the Imperial German Navy, and who had argued, with the confidence of institutional conviction, that Germany's path to great power status ran through the construction of a battle fleet that Britain would have to treat with respect. Raeder carried that lesson into the 1930s and applied it to the program that became Plan Z. He was not wrong that such a fleet would have been formidable. He was, in the end, simply operating too slowly against an event to the war's premature outbreak in 1939 that his program had not been designed to survive. His relationship with Hitler was formal, professionally correct, and fundamentally unsatisfying for both parties. Raeder believed in institutional hierarchy and in the Navy's right to pursue its strategic logic without political interference in operational details. Hitler believed in personal control of military decisions and had a land power mindset that made him consistently skeptical of the Navy's claims about the decisive importance of the maritime war. When Raeder argued for more resources for surface ship construction, Hitler's attention was on the army in Russia. When Raeder argued for aggressive use of the Norwegian surface force, Hitler worried about the loss of prestige capital ships in unequal engagements. The relationship was marked by a persistent mismatch between what the naval commander believed was strategically necessary and what the political leader was willing to authorize. Raeder was not a man who could easily adapt his institutional convictions to political convenience, and this inflexibility, while reflecting a kind of professional integrity, also limited his effectiveness as an advocate for the Navy's interests at the highest level. The crisis that ended Raeder's tenure came in January of 1943, during an engagement that became known as the Battle of the Barents Sea. A German surface force built around the heavy cruisers Hipper and Lutzow had sortied from Norway to attack a British Arctic convoy designated WW2. The engagement that followed was tactically inconclusive. The German force, in the face of aggressive defensive action by British destroyers and cruisers, broke off the engagement and returned to port without destroying the convoy. No British cruisers were sunk. No merchant ships were sunk. 2 British destroyers were lost, but the convoy reached its destination essentially intact. From a purely military standpoint, it was a disappointing but not catastrophic result. From Hitler's political standpoint, it was something much worse. The news of the battle reached Hitler in a distorted form. An initial report from German naval communications suggested a more significant engagement than had actually occurred, followed by a clarifying report that revealed the disappointing reality. Hitler's reaction was extreme. He declared that the large surface ships were useless, that they were consuming resources without contributing to the war effort, that the steel and materials used in their construction would have been better employed building submarines or land weapons. He ordered Raeder to his headquarters and delivered a sustained verbal assault on the surface navy's performance and value that was, by any reasonable account, disproportionate to what had actually happened at the Barents Sea. Raeder, who was 66 years old and had spent 4 decades in German naval service, listened and then submitted his resignation. It was accepted. Karl Dönitz became Commander-in-Chief of the Kriegsmarine in January 1943. The moment, with bitter historical irony, when the submarine campaign he had built was approaching its turning point. He had spent years arguing that submarines were the decisive weapon in the maritime war, that the resources given to surface ships should have been allocated to the submarine arm, that with enough submarines he could have severed Britain's supply lines before American industrial power entered the equation. Now he had the command, and the submarine campaign that had been his instrument of strategic pressure was about to face the crisis of May 1943. The window he had identified was closing, and he was being given authority to use the key just as the lock was changing. Dönitz's personality was different from Raeder's in ways that shaped the submarine arms culture as distinctively as any tactical doctrine. He was deeply personalized in his relationship with his crews. He knew commanders by name, he attended departure ceremonies when possible, he corresponded with families when boats were lost. He was called the Lion by his submariners, a title of genuine affection. He believed in maintaining morale through personal connection and through the projection of confidence, even when the strategic situation did not support it. Through the terrible losses of 1943 and 1944, when submarines were being sunk at rates that should have been demoralizing by any reasonable assessment, he maintained the public position that new technologies and new tactics would restore the campaign's effectiveness. Whether this was genuine conviction or strategic communication management, or some mixture of both, is a question that his memoir, written after the war, does not entirely resolve. His strategic arguments were also genuinely compelling in their own terms. The submarine building program was accelerating throughout 1942 and 1943. New designs were in development that addressed the fundamental vulnerabilities the current submarine force was facing. The Type 21 submarine, designed with a greatly enlarged battery capacity that would allow it to travel significant distances underwater at speeds that current submarines could not sustain, was the most significant of these. It was designed to render much of the Allied anti-submarine capability developed through 1943 obsolete, because the tactics and equipment developed to deal with conventional submarines operating primarily on the surface were less effective against a submarine that could operate mostly submerged at useful speeds. Dönitz pressed for the Type 21 with urgency. His problem was that German shipbuilding and industrial capacity, under increasing Allied bombing pressure, could not produce the new submarines fast enough to change the campaign's outcome before the war's overall trajectory made the question moot. The political dimension of Dönitz's career adds a layer of complexity that is uncomfortable to engage with and impossible to avoid. He was a committed servant of the National Socialist state, and his submarine campaign was conducted within a political framework that he accepted without apparent reservation. The question of what he knew about the regime's wider crimes, and when he knew it, occupied the Nuremberg tribunal and has occupied historians ever since. What is established in the record is that he commanded an effective military force, that he directed a campaign that killed thousands of merchant sailors who were, by most legal definitions of the era, protected from deliberate attack, and that he served as the regime's chosen successor when Hitler died in April of 1945, briefly holding the title of Reich President for the final days before Germany's unconditional surrender. He was tried at Nuremberg, convicted of war crimes and crimes against peace, and sentenced to 10 years in prison. He served the full sentence and died in 1980, the last surviving Grand Admiral of the Kriegsmarine. The tension between Raider and Dönitz surface fleet versus submarine arm, prestige versus attrition, institutional conservatism versus tactical innovation was never resolved within the Kriegsmarine, because the war ended before either approach achieved the conditions its proponent believed were necessary for success. Raider's surface fleet never received the resources Plan Z envisioned. Dönitz's submarines never received the 300 boats he believed were necessary to make the Atlantic campaign mathematically decisive before Allied industrial power became overwhelming. Both men were working within constraints imposed by a political leadership that understood land warfare intuitively and sea power only abstractly, a leadership that gave the Navy what was left after the Army and Air Force had taken what they believed they needed, and then blamed the Navy when the resulting force was insufficient for the task assigned. The story of both commanders is, at its core, the story of men trying to fight a sea war with the tools of a land power. Chapter 12. New Weapons, Old Ocean. By the autumn of 1943, the Kriegsmarine submarine force was in a position that Dönitz described, in his private communications with his staff, as temporarily untenable but not permanently lost. The losses of May 1943 had forced the withdrawal from the North Atlantic convoy routes. The technological and tactical advantages that the Allies had developed, centimetric radar, the Lee light, improved depth charges, better coordinated escort groups, long-range aircraft closing the mid-Atlantic gap, had made the standard Atlantic submarine patrol far more dangerous than at any previous point in the campaign. But Dönitz had not lost faith in the fundamental strategic logic that had driven the campaign from its beginning. Britain still depended on sea lanes. The sea lanes could still, in principle, be threatened. What was needed was not a different strategy, but new weapons that could restore the submarine's ability to operate in contested waters without the unacceptable loss rates of the summer of 1943. The technical responses to the Allied anti-submarine advantage took several forms, and they reflect the ingenuity of the German naval engineering establishment, operating under conditions of growing industrial constraint and Allied bombing pressure. The most immediately deployed was the Zaunkönig acoustic torpedo, which the crews nicknamed the Wren. Unlike a standard torpedo that ran on a programmed course, the Zaunkönig was designed to home on the propeller noise of a target vessel, particularly the high-speed propellers of escort destroyers and frigates. Its introduction, in the autumn of 1943, created a brief period of alarm among Allied escort commanders, who had to develop countermeasures, a towed noise-making device called Foxer that drew the acoustic torpedo away from the ship's propellers before the weapon's effectiveness could be reliably neutralized. The introduction and countermeasure cycle played out over a matter of weeks, illustrating both the genuine technical capability of German naval engineering and the speed with which Allied countermeasure development could respond to new threats. The Schnorkel, a retractable tube that allowed a submarine's diesel engines to draw air and exhaust fumes while the vessel remained at periscope depth, was perhaps the most practically significant technical development. adopted by the U-boat force in the war's later period. The concept was not originally German, it had been developed by the Dutch Navy, and the technology had been captured when Germany occupied the Netherlands in 1940. Its adaptation and widespread fitting to German submarines from late 1943 and through 1944 allowed submarines to recharge their batteries and travel significant distances without surfacing, directly addressing the vulnerability that centimetric radar had created by making surface operations so dangerous. A submarine with a snorkel could theoretically operate in Allied patrolled waters for extended periods without presenting the surfaced radar return that had been the primary detection mechanism since 1943. The practical experience of using the snorkel was, however, considerably less comfortable than its tactical advantages suggested. The device was prone to flooding in heavy seas. Running diesels while submerged created pressure fluctuations inside the submarine that caused painful and sometimes damaging effects on crews' eardrums. The snorkel mast extended only to periscope depth, which meant the submarine had to maintain precise depth control to prevent either the intake flooding in rough water or the mast breaking the surface and becoming visible to aircraft. In the conditions of the North Atlantic, where seas were frequently too rough for comfortable snorkel operation, these were not trivial limitations. Crews who had previously found surfacing and submerging to be manageable tactical decisions now found themselves committed to long periods of uncomfortable, mechanically demanding submerged operation in conditions that placed enormous strain on both the machinery and the men. The new generation of submarines that Dönitz pressed for throughout the later war years represented a more fundamental technological response to the Allied advantage. The Type 21 electroboat, as it was called, was designed from the outset as a true submarine rather than a submersible surface vessel, a distinction that goes to the heart of how submarine warfare had been conducted up to that point. Conventional submarines had been designed to operate primarily on the surface, using their diesel engines for propulsion and their electrical motors only for submerged operation, which was necessarily brief and slow because the battery capacity could not sustain high speed for long periods. The Type 21 carried battery capacity roughly 3 times that of the Type 7, which allowed it to travel at high underwater speeds for extended periods, sprint away from approaching escorts before they could close to attack, and remain submerged through an entire transit from base to patrol area and back. It was, in technical conception, the basis of the post-war nuclear submarine age. The problem of the Type 21 was, like so many German technical achievements of the war's later period, one of timing and production capacity rather than technical merit. The design was sound. The concept was correct. The submarines that were eventually completed and put through trials demonstrated performance characteristics that alarmed Allied analysts who assessed captured examples after the war. But the program was delayed and disrupted by Allied bombing, by the complexity of the prefabricated construction method adopted to speed production, by materials shortages, and by the prioritization of other programs that competed for the same industrial resources. Of the many Type 21 submarines commissioned, only 2 conducted operational patrols before Germany surrendered. Neither resulted in a ship being sunk. The weapon that might, if deployed a year earlier in sufficient numbers, have posed a genuinely new challenge to Allied anti-submarine methods arrived too late to influence the outcome it had been designed to change. The acoustic torpedoes, the new radar warning receivers, the improved passive sonar, the snorkel, the electroboats taken together, these developments represented a genuine and sustained technical effort to restore capability to a submarine arm that was being outpaced by Allied countermeasure development. That the effort ultimately failed to change the strategic outcome does not reflect the inadequacy of the technical work. It reflects more precisely the asymmetry of industrial scale between Germany, fighting on multiple fronts with a single continental economy, and the combined industrial capacity of Britain, its empire, and the United States, which by 1943 was producing ships, aircraft, weapons, and electronic systems at rates that German planning had consistently and fatally underestimated. Germany was technically creative under constraint. Its adversaries were technically competent with abundance. In a prolonged war of attrition, abundance tends to defeat creativity. The submarine bases on the French Atlantic coast, which had been so strategically important since their acquisition in 1940, came under growing threat as the war's strategic geography shifted. The Allied landings in Normandy in June 1944 opened the process by which those bases would be captured, cut off, or rendered operationally untenable. German submarines could still shelter in the massive concrete pens that defied conventional bombing, but the logistics of supplying and manning those bases became increasingly complicated as Allied forces advanced. Submarines operating from Brest and Lorient in the autumn of 1944 did so in the knowledge that the land connections to the German war economy were being severed, that the extraordinary infrastructure of the French Atlantic base system, built at such enormous cost and effort between 1940 and 1941, was slipping away. The bases at Lorient and Brest and Saint-Nazaire were eventually besieged rather than captured. The surrounding Allied forces contained the German garrisons but found direct assault too costly. The garrisons held out until Germany's final surrender in May 1945, making them among the last German forces to lay down arms. The human dimension of this technological competition, what it meant for the men serving in submarines through the war's later years, is a story of eroding margins. The submarines were operating in conditions where the probability of return from a patrol had declined dramatically from the confident early years of the campaign. Veteran commanders knew the changed mathematics. Junior crew members sensed it without being able to articulate the statistics. The ritual of departure from port, the ceremonies that had once been celebratory occasions with crowds and flowers, had acquired a different character. The submarine pens at the French bases, which had once felt like fortresses of capability, felt increasingly like the outer edge of a shrinking operational world. New technologies were arriving. New submarines were being commissioned. The Lion was telling his crews that victory was still achievable with the right tools and the right commitment. Many believed him. The ocean, indifferent to belief, was keeping its own statistics. Chapter 13. The collapse of the Atlantic campaign. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from a single catastrophic defeat, but from the slow, cumulative weight of a campaign that has been grinding in the wrong direction for too long. By the winter of 1943 and into the spring of 1944, the men of the Kriegsmarine submarine arm knew that exhaustion intimately. Not every crew member could have articulated it in strategic terms. Most were too young, too focused on the immediate demands of their vessel and their patrol, too insulated from the full statistical picture to see the arc clearly. But they felt it in the way that men who work in dangerous conditions always feel the mathematics of risk before they can name them. Patrols that had once produced tonnage figures that filled the naval press were now more likely to produce nothing long, uncomfortable weeks at sea, schnorchel running in rough water, listening to Allied sonar pings from above, returning to port with full torpedo tubes and hollow eyes. The production figures for Allied merchant shipping, which Dunitz's planners had consistently underestimated throughout the war, had by 1943 reached levels that fundamentally undermined the strategic logic of the tonnage war. The basic premise of the submarine campaign, that submarines could sink ships faster than Allied yards could build them, depended on a specific relationship between the two rates. In 1942, that relationship had come perilously close to favouring Germany. Allied shipping losses in that year were severe enough that serious analysts in both London and Washington privately questioned whether the arithmetic was sustainable. But the American shipbuilding program, particularly the mass production of Liberty ships, standardized cargo vessels built in sections at multiple yards simultaneously, assembled with a speed that traditional shipbuilding methods could not approach, had shifted that arithmetic decisively. By the second half of 1943, Allied yards were launching new merchant tonnage at rates that exceeded even the worst monthly loss figures of the entire war. The submarines were sinking ships. The yards were building replacements faster than the submarines could send them to the bottom. The strategic precondition of the campaign had quietly dissolved. The consequence of this shift was visible in the Atlantic's operational pattern, with increasing clarity through the second half of 1943 and through 1944. Wolfpack operations continued. Dönitz did not abandon the convoy route entirely after May 1943, and there were renewed attempts to employ groups of submarines against specific convoys during the autumn of 1943 that inflicted genuine losses. But the pattern of those engagements had changed fundamentally. The Wolfpacks were now regularly intercepted before they could assemble effectively. Individual submarines were being detected and attacked earlier in their patrol cycles. The Allied escort groups, which had developed a tactical sophistication through 18 months of intense operational experience, were no longer simply reacting to submarine attacks. They were hunting proactively, using a combination of intelligence, radar, sonar, and aerial coordination to pursue submarines into their patrol positions and force engagements on Allied terms rather than German ones. The hunter had become, more often than not, the hunted. The statistics of submarine loss through 1944 are among the starkest in the entire naval history of the war. The Kriegsmarine's submarine arm was losing boats at rates that made simple replacement impossible. Training pipelines that had been calibrated for the loss rates of 1941 were overwhelmed by the realities of 1944. Young commanders who had trained for months were being lost on their first patrols before they could accumulate the experience that might have kept them alive on the second. The Type 7 submarine that had been the backbone of the Atlantic campaign since 1940 was being systematically destroyed by a combination of Allied capabilities that its designers had not been required to anticipate when the type was specified in the mid-1930s. The boats were not inadequate for the war they had been designed to fight. They were simply operating in a strategic environment that had moved far beyond the conditions of their design assumptions. The experience of individual submarine crews during this period has been documented in accounts written after the war, and what emerges from those accounts is a picture of professional persistence in conditions of mounting uncertainty. Men continued to volunteer for submarine service. The training continued. The patrols departed on schedule. The culture of the submarine arm, its emphasis on technical competence, crew solidarity, trust in the commander, and pride in the institution remained intact as an institutional reality, even as the strategic situation deteriorated. This persistence was not irrational, though it might appear so in retrospect. Men who have invested years in a demanding professional culture, who have developed real bonds of trust with their crewmates, and who believe that the situation might yet change with the right technical solution or the right operational opportunity, do not simply stop. They continue, and they manage the fear by focusing on the immediate technical demands of keeping their vessel operational and their crew alive. This is how professional military units function under deteriorating conditions, and the submarine arm of the Kriegsmarine was no exception. The Allied escort carrier groups that had come to define the mid-Atlantic operational environment by 1944 represented a development that Dönitz had anticipated in general terms, but had underestimated in specific. Impact. A small carrier, typically a converted merchant hull, capable of operating a dozen or more aircraft, could now accompany a convoy across the Atlantic, placing air coverage directly over the formation through its entire passage, rather than relying on land-based aircraft whose coverage was geographically constrained. The aircraft operating from these carriers, Grumman Avengers, Fairey Swordfish, other types adapted for maritime patrol, could attack surface submarines from above, coordinate with surface escorts to prosecute submerged contacts, and extend the detection perimeter around the convoy to distances that made it increasingly difficult for a submarine to position itself for a surface attack without being detected and driven off before reaching attack range. The mid-Atlantic gap, which had been the submarine arm's most valuable operational geography, was now effectively covered. There was no longer any region of the North Atlantic convoy routes where a submarine could count on operating without the possibility of aircraft overhead. The shore-based air forces that complemented the escort carriers, particularly RAF Coastal Command operating from Britain and Iceland, and United States Army Air Forces maritime patrol squadrons, operating from bases in Newfoundland, Iceland, and eventually the Azores had developed anti-submarine operations to a level of professional sophistication that would have been unrecognizable to the first Atlantic convoy escorts of 1939. Dedicated maritime patrol aircraft, flying long sorties over the ocean, equipped with radar, depth charges, acoustic buoys, and in some cases airborne torpedoes, maintained a persistent aerial presence over the convoy routes that forced submarines to remain submerged for far longer periods than their battery capacity was designed to sustain. A submarine that had been forced to dive by an aircraft contact would need to remain down until the aircraft departed, would surface briefly to recharge batteries and risk another detection, and would find its sprint speed, its ability to move rapidly on the surface, to reposition for an attack, severely constrained by the need to maintain near-constant submersion. The Schnorchel helped with battery recharging. It did not restore the tactical freedom of the early war surface operations. By the spring of 1944, the Kriegsmarine submarine arm had effectively lost the Battle of the Atlantic as a strategic campaign capable of influencing the war's outcome. This does not mean the submarines stopped fighting. They continued to operate, to conduct patrols, and occasionally to achieve genuine results against Allied shipping through the final year of the war. But the strategic context of those results had changed entirely. They were no longer operations that could plausibly threaten the Allied supply chain to a degree that would affect land operations. They were operations that imposed costs on the Allies' real costs, in ships and crews and cargo, but costs that the Allied maritime system had the resilience and the production capacity to absorb. A campaign that had come genuinely close to strategic effectiveness in 1942 had, by early 1944, become a costly form of attrition that the side conducting it could afford less well than the side absorbing it. Dönitz understood this, though he would not say it in those terms publicly or, in some respects, privately. He continued to press for the new technologies, the Type 21, the improvements that might yet change the calculation. The spring of 1944 came and went, and the calculation did not change. The effect of the submarine campaign's failure on the Kriegsmarine as an institution was felt across every dimension of the service. The resources that had been allocated to submarine construction and submarine operations through 4 years of war had not produced the strategic outcome they were designed to achieve. The surface fleet had been gutted by losses and Hitler's operational caution. The new submarine designs were arriving too slowly and in too few numbers. The French base system was being overrun by the Allied land advance following the Normandy landings. The Norwegian surface force had lost the Scharnhorst, and the Tirpitz was neutralized. The Baltic, which had once been a safe operational area for German naval forces, was becoming contested as Soviet forces advanced along the Baltic coast. The Kriegsmarine in the autumn of 1944 was an institution fighting on contracting margins in every direction, doing so with the discipline and professional commitment that had characterized it from the beginning, but without the strategic leverage that would have made that commitment meaningful in terms of the war's outcome. The end of the Atlantic campaign as a strategic contest is usually dated to the spring of 1943, but its human ending came much later, in dozens of individual moments spread across the final 2 years of the war. Every submarine that departed its base in the autumn of 1944 made its passage through increasingly dangerous waters, searched for convoys that were now far better defended than anything the earliest Wolfpack crews had faced, and returned, if it returned with nothing to show for the weeks at sea, was living through the final phase of a campaign that had already been decided. The men aboard those submarines had not personally made the decisions that had brought the campaign to this point. They were the inheritors of institutional commitments made years before they joined the service, operating within strategic constraints that no individual tactical performance could overcome. Their professionalism was real. The cause it served, by the autumn of 1944, was already lost, though the orders would continue, and the patrols would continue, and the ocean would continue to keep its statistics for many months yet. Chapter 14. The Surface Fleet's Final Seasons. While the submarine campaign was fighting its long rearguard action against technological and numerical disadvantage in the Atlantic, the Kriegsmarine's surface fleet was entering its own final chapter, a period defined by shrinking operational horizons, growing fuel shortages, and the gradual recognition that the grand surface fleet that Raeder had spent his career building was ending the war as a shadow of the force it had been intended to become. The loss of the Bismarck in May 1941 and the Scharnhorst in December 1943 had removed the two ships most associated with the Kriegsmarine's surface offensive capability. What remained was a collection of vessels that were increasingly confined to the Baltic and Norwegian waters by fuel availability, operational orders that prioritized survival over action, and a strategic context that offered diminishing opportunities for surface warfare of any meaningful kind. The heavy cruiser Hipper and her half-sister Seydlitz had been among the more active surface units of the Middle War period, participating in Arctic convoy interception attempts and providing the firepower component of Norwegian-based task forces. The Hipper had achieved genuine operational results, her raid on the Allied convoy HX-84 in November 1940, in which she sank the armed merchant cruiser HMS Jervis Bay and 5 other merchant vessels, had been one of the more effective single operations by a German surface ship during the commerce raiding period. But Hipper was also increasingly expensive to maintain and fuel, and by the later war period she was spending more time in port than at sea. The Admiral Scheer, which had conducted an extended Atlantic and Indian Ocean raiding voyage in 1940 and 1941 that produced good results by the standards of surface commerce warfare, was similarly constrained by the progressive deterioration of Germany's fuel supply situation as the war continued. The fuel problem deserves more attention than it typically receives in accounts of the Kriegsmarine's later war period. German fuel oil supply depended on a combination of domestic synthetic fuel production, imported Romanian crude oil, and the outputs of refineries that were increasingly targeted by Allied strategic bombing. The naval fuel allocation was always a matter of competition with the Army and Air Force, and as the land war on the Eastern Front became more demanding, the Navy's allocation was periodically reduced to levels that limited operational planning. A surface ship that cannot be fueled cannot operate. The Tirpitz, enormous in displacement and appetite, consumed fuel simply by maintaining steam and keeping her machinery in operational condition. The cost of keeping her ready to sail was, in fuel terms, considerable, even when she was sitting stationary in a Norwegian fjord. As fuel shortages worsened through 1943 and 1944, the question of how to allocate what was available between maintaining the fleet in being and actually operating it became increasingly constrained in both directions simultaneously. The battlecruiser Gneisenau had suffered a different fate than most of her contemporary surface sisters. Damaged by RAF bombing while in the dry dock at Kiel in February of 1942, she had been moved to the Norwegian port of Gdynia for repair. Then, in a decision that reflected the changing strategic calculations about surface fleet utility, her main gun turrets were removed to provide armament for coastal defense batteries, and the ship was effectively placed in a state of long-term repair that was, in practice, indefinite suspension. She would never fire her guns in anger again. Her decommissioning, carried out progressively through modifications that left her hollowed of offensive capacity, was a metaphor for the surface fleet's overall trajectory. The ships were there, physically present, consuming maintenance resources and occupying berths. But the operational purpose that had justified their construction was shrinking steadily, and the institutional will to employ them aggressively had been largely extinguished by Hitler's standing orders for caution. The Channel Dash of February 1942, the operation designated Cerberus, stands as perhaps the most audacious surface operation the Kriegsmarine conducted in the war's middle period, and its legacy is ambiguous in a way that perfectly captures the contradictions of German surface naval strategy. The Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, and Prinz Eugen had been based at Brest on the French Atlantic coast since the spring of 1941, where they represented both a threat to Allied shipping and a constant target for RAF bombing. By early 1942, with damage accumulating and the strategic situation shifting, the decision was made to relocate the ships to Norwegian waters, where they could threaten the Arctic convoys. The route chosen was the most direct, straight through the English Channel in broad daylight, covered by Luftwaffe fighters and supported by German destroyers and torpedo boats. The British, whose intelligence suggested such a move was planned, had prepared responses, but coordination failures and mechanical problems meant that the responses arrived piecemeal and too late. The three ships completed their dash through the channel and reached German ports, though Scharnhorst and Gneisenau both struck mines and required subsequent repairs. Strategically, the operation was a German success. The ships had escaped. Psychologically, in Britain, the sight of German warships steaming through the English Channel in daylight without being stopped was a considerable shock, and the British press was openly humiliating about the failure to intercept. The Prinz Eugen, the heavy cruiser that had accompanied the Bismarck on her fatal last voyage and been one of the few German surface ships to emerge from that period with her operational record relatively intact, became an increasingly important unit as the larger ships were lost or neutralized. She was damaged by a British submarine torpedo in February of 1942 while operating in Norwegian waters, an attack that put her out of service for months and demonstrated that even in what were considered relatively secure coastal waters, German surface ships were exposed to submarine attack. After repairs, she returned to operational service and participated in various operations through the later war years, ultimately finding her most significant role not as a commerce raider or fleet unit, but as a shore bombardment vessel, supporting German land forces on the Eastern Front, a role that represented, in its own way, the final subordination of the surface fleet to the Army's requirements that Raeder had spent his career resisting. The Lutzow, formerly the Deutschland, renamed to avoid the propaganda disaster of a ship bearing the country's name being sunk, operated as a component of the Norwegian surface force before also being transferred to Baltic operations. Her career illustrates the odd trajectory of the pocket battleships, which had been designed as autonomous ocean-going commerce raiders and ended the war operating as essentially mobile coastal artillery. The transition from oceanic ambitions to Baltic fire support was not a decline that any of the ship's designers or her crew's early commanders had anticipated, but it was a transition that the strategic circumstances of 1943 and 1944 made unavoidable. The ships were there, they had guns, the guns could reach shore targets. The Army needed fire support. The logic was simple, even if the institutional implications were melancholy. The Allied bombing campaigns against German naval facilities and the ships themselves were an increasingly significant factor in the surface fleet's operational constraints. Through 1943 and 1944, the RAF and USAAF were developing, through the same period, both the navigational accuracy and the weapon technology needed to engage specific naval targets with improved precision. The development of large penetrating bombs, the 12,000-pound tall boy that would ultimately destroy the Tirpitz, represented the maturation of a weapons development strand that had been running since the early war years. German shipyards and dry docks were repeatedly targeted, creating repair backlogs that kept ships out of service for extended periods. Ships that might have been returned to operational condition in a matter of weeks were sitting in damaged dry docks awaiting facilities that were themselves under repair. The cumulative effect of bomber campaign, fuel shortage, Hitler's operational caution, and the loss of key units through combat and accident was a surface fleet that by the winter of 1944 was operationally marginalized in a way that would have seemed inconceivable to Raeder and his planners in the US. Optimistic early months of 1940. The final operational role that the surviving surface ships would fulfill was one that no naval strategist had written into the planning documents of the 1930s, and it would prove to be among the most consequential humanitarian operations of the entire war. As Soviet forces advanced along the Baltic coast through the winter of 1944 and into 1945, the German army's position on the Eastern Front collapsed in a sequence of withdrawals and encirclements that placed enormous numbers of German military personnel and civilians in desperate situations along the Baltic shoreline. The surface fleet that had been designed to threaten British shipping in the Atlantic found itself, in the war's final months, performing an entirely different mission, one that had nothing to do with the strategic ambitions that had justified its existence, and everything to do with the immediate human emergency unfolding on the Eastern fronts. Retreating Edge. That story belongs to a later chapter, but the ships that would carry it out, the cruisers, the destroyers, the transport vessels, were the direct inheritors of a fleet built for one kind of war and ending it in the service of a very different kind of necessity. Chapter 15. The Eastern Front reaches the sea. The Baltic Sea is not, in the common imagination of the Second World War, the body of water that defines the Kriegsmarine's story. That distinction belongs to the Atlantic, to the grey North Atlantic swells, the wolf packs, the convoys, the depth charges, the statistics of a prolonged maritime campaign that stretched from the war's first day to nearly its last. But in the war's final winter, the winter of 1944 and 1945, the Baltic became the stage for a Kriegsmarine operation of extraordinary scale and human consequence, an operation that bore no resemblance to anything the naval planners of the 1930s had imagined, and that became one of the largest maritime evacuations in history. It was not a story of naval power in the strategic sense. It was a story of ships and the people who sailed them doing the only thing left to be done, carrying people away from catastrophe. The military situation on Germany's Eastern Front through the autumn and winter of 1944 was deteriorating with a speed that the German command in Berlin struggled to fully acknowledge publicly, even as the reality became impossible to manage privately. Soviet forces had advanced through the summer and autumn months in a series of operations that had shattered German army groups, recaptured enormous territories, and pushed the front westward into what had recently been German-occupied Eastern Europe and now threatened the borders of the Reich itself. Along the Baltic coast, the Soviet advance had isolated entire German army formations in coastal pockets in Kurland, in East Prussia, in Pomerania cut off from the main German forces to the west, dependent on sea supply and eventual sea evacuation for their survival. The Baltic, which had been a safe German lake since the beginning of the war, was now a contested operational environment with Soviet aircraft, Soviet submarines, and eventually Soviet surface forces operating within its waters. The German civilian population of the eastern Baltic regions, East Prussia, Danzig, Pomerania, the eastern Baltic provinces faced a situation of immediate and overwhelming danger as Soviet forces approached. These were populations that had lived in these territories for generations, and many had remained through the war's middle period with a confidence, or perhaps a deliberate refusal to acknowledge the alternative, that the Eastern Front's worst possibilities would not reach them. By the winter of 1944, that confidence was no longer sustainable. The Soviet offensive into East Prussia in January of 1945 drove enormous numbers of civilians onto the roads and toward the Baltic ports. Königsberg, Danzig, Gotenhafen, Pillau, Kolberg in conditions of winter cold and military chaos that caused immense suffering even before any ship was involved. Hundreds of thousands of people converged on ports that were themselves under military pressure, seeking passage west by sea in any vessel that could be found. The Kriegsmarine's response to this crisis was the operation that became known collectively as the evacuation of the East, a series of related operations running through the winter and spring of 1945 that, together, constituted what naval historians have called the largest maritime evacuation in history, exceeding even the famous evacuation at Dunkirk by a considerable margin in total numbers carried. The Naval Command assigned every vessel that could make the crossing warships, merchant ships, passenger liners requisitioned for military service, ferries, hospital ships, smaller craft of every description to the task of carrying people westward across the Baltic to ports in western Germany and Denmark. The ships ran the route continuously, some making multiple crossings, all operating in conditions made more dangerous by winter storms, Soviet air attack, Soviet submarine activity, and the mines laid in Baltic waters over years of operations by both sides. The heavy cruisers and other surface warships that remained operational contributed to the evacuation in ways that reflected their characteristics, their speed, their size, and in some cases their ability to provide covering fire against Soviet forces pressing toward the embarkation ports. The cruiser Emden, one of the older vessels in the fleet, was used to transport the remains of the philosopher Immanuel Kant from Königsberg westward, a detail that carries the particular quality of historical symbolism that emerges in the final stages of collapsing worlds. The newer cruisers made multiple evacuation runs, carrying thousands of civilians on each crossing, their passenger capacity improvised in spaces that had been designed for warfighting equipment rather than human beings. The destroyers escorted the slower vessels and provided anti-submarine screening in waters where Soviet submarines were active and Soviet aircraft increasingly bold. The losses among the evacuation vessels were severe and in several cases catastrophic. The most devastating single loss came on the evening of the 30th of January 1945, when the large passenger liner Wilhelm Gustloff, carrying an estimated several thousand people, including submarine trainees, naval personnel, wounded soldiers, and thousands of refugees, with precise numbers disputed by historians, was struck by 3 torpedoes from the Soviet submarine S-13 and sank in the cold waters of the Baltic. The loss of life in those waters, in winter temperatures that allowed survival for only minutes, was among the greatest in maritime history. Estimates of those who perished range from perhaps 5,000 to 9,000, with the precise figure uncertain because the improvised conditions of the embarkation had not permitted careful manifesting of all passengers. It remains, by most assessments, the worst maritime disaster in recorded history. The Steuben, a smaller passenger vessel, was sunk by the same Soviet submarine 8 days after the Wilhelm Gustloff, with the loss of most of those aboard. The Goya, a large transport, was torpedoed in April of 1945 with losses that similarly ran into the thousands. The scale of these individual disasters, each one exceeding in casualties the most famous maritime disasters of peacetime, were occurring in rapid succession, in a confined sea, against the background of an evacuation that was simultaneously saving hundreds of thousands of lives on other ships making the same crossing successfully. The men commanding the evacuation vessels, many of them merchant navy officers who had been pressed into military service, some of them regular Kriegsmarine officers who had spent years in very different roles, were making impossible decisions about how many people to load, how fast to sail, which routes offered the best balance of speed against mine risk, and how to manage the chaos of embarkation ports where the pressure from waiting crowds vastly exceeded the available vessel capacity. The total numbers evacuated by sea from the eastern Baltic in the final months of the war are estimated at somewhere between 1.5 million and 2.5 million people. The precise figure is complicated by incomplete records, the improvised nature of the operation, and the complex mixture of military personnel, wounded soldiers, and civilians that comprise the evacuee population. Whatever the precise number, it represents an achievement of organizational capacity under conditions of extreme operational pressure that stands as one of the most significant maritime operations of the entire war, not in the strategic sense that naval planners value, but in the human sense that measures what ships and their crews can accomplish when the urgency is absolute. The Kriegsmarine had been designed and equipped to fight a war of sea power projection and commerce interdiction. In its final months, it was doing something entirely different, something that its founders and planners had never imagined would be its ultimate purpose. And it was doing it with a commitment and a cost in lives that would not be widely understood or acknowledged for decades, because the story of German wartime suffering was, for understandable reasons, not a story that the post-war world was in a hurry to tell. The Soviet air and submarine threat to the Baltic evacuation routes intensified through February and March of 1945 as Soviet forces consolidated their position along the Baltic coast and Soviet naval aviation extended its operational reach over the crossing routes. The German air forces, which had provided some degree of air cover over the evacuation routes in January, were being stretched beyond their capacity by demands from multiple fronts simultaneously. The escorts available to protect evacuation convoys were insufficient in number and increasingly worn by continuous operations. The mines that had been laid in Baltic waters over years of operations by both German and Allied forces created route constraints that funneled vessels into patterns predictable enough to be exploited. The men who sailed the evacuation routes in those final months were operating under conditions of sustained danger, the kind of sustained danger that wears men down, not through single dramatic moments of terror, but through the accumulated tension of knowing that the threat is present, that the defenses are inadequate, and that the next crossing might be the one that ends badly. By the spring of 1945, the evacuation was drawing toward its end simply because the geography of German-controlled territory along the Baltic coast was contracting to the point where embarkation ports were being overrun or were no longer accessible. Königsberg fell to Soviet forces in April of 1945. Danzig and Gotenhafen fell in late March. The pockets of German forces in Courland and in the Hella Peninsula off the Polish coast continued to hold, fed by sea supply and still generating evacuation traffic, but their hold was measured in weeks rather than months. The ships that had been making the Baltic crossing through the winter continued, carrying what people and material they could, until the end came not with the formal strategic decision of a defeated fleet commander, but with the grinding cessation of possibilities, one port at a time, one crossing at a time, until there was nowhere left to evacuate to and nothing left to evacuate with. Chapter 16. The Final Patrols. There is something both admirable and melancholy about institutional persistence in the face of strategic impossibility. By the late autumn of 1944, and through the final months of the war in 1945, the Kriegsmarine's submarine arm was conducting patrols that could not, by any realistic assessment, change the war's outcome. The decision-making apparatus that produced those patrols, the orders, the training, the departures from port, the careful maintenance of vessel readiness continued to function with a professional regularity that was almost entirely decoupled from the strategic context in which it operated. Men were being trained and sent to sea in submarines in the final weeks of the war. They were being asked to conduct patrols against Allied shipping in waters that were now so thoroughly dominated by Allied anti-submarine capability that survival, rather than achievement, had become the primary operational objective. And they went, not because they were forced, in most cases, because the institution had its momentum, and because men who have committed themselves to a profession do not easily step outside its imperatives, even when the imperatives have become, in the deepest sense, purposeless. The submarine arms loss rate through the war's final year was among the highest of any period in the campaign. The combination of Allied radar, long-range aircraft, sophisticated escort group tactics, and intelligence advantage had created an anti-submarine environment of extraordinary lethality. A submarine departing on patrol in the autumn of 1944 faced odds of survival that were, by the statistical record, worse than at any previous point in the war. The boats that were still operational were the older Type 7s, supplemented by a slowly growing number of the new electro boats. But the electro boats were arriving too slowly and too late to change the operational calculus. The training pipeline was producing crews for vessels that were being sunk faster than the new types could compensate. The arithmetic of the final period was severe in a way that the official communications from Dunitz's headquarters could not entirely conceal from the men who were living it. The few Type 21 submarines that actually reached operational status before Germany's surrender represent one of the war's more tantalizing counterfactuals. The question of what might have happened if they had arrived in significant numbers a year earlier. The U-2511, one of the first Type 21s to complete trials and working up, departed on her first war patrol in the final days of the war and returned to port after Germany had surrendered without having engaged the enemy. The technical performance of the boat during her trials had reportedly impressed even those who had designed her. She could sustain high underwater speeds that made current Allied anti-submarine prosecution methods problematic. She was quieter than the Type 7. Her battery capacity allowed genuinely extended submerged operations, but she had arrived when the context that would have allowed her capabilities to matter had already passed. The war was over before she fired a torpedo in anger, and the submarines that were going to win a new phase of the campaign existed only in yards and on test runs, while the men in the Type 7s were dying in the waters they had been fighting for 5 years. The coastal submarine campaign that developed in British home waters and in the approaches to British ports during the war's final period represented a final tactical adaptation by the German submarine command. In shallower, more geographically constrained waters, the standard Allied anti-submarine tactics designed primarily for open ocean convoy defense were less straightforward to apply. Submarines operating in the shallow inshore waters around the British Isles, using the Schnorchel to remain submerged for extended periods, could occasionally find opportunities that the Atlantic convoy routes no longer offered. The losses in these operations were still severe. Shallow water is in some respects more dangerous for a submarine than open ocean, because the margin for error in depth keeping is smaller and the options for evasion after an attack are more constrained. But the inshore campaign produced occasional results and continued into the war's final weeks, with submarines sinking merchant ships and occasional warships in British coastal waters, even as Germany's position on land was collapsing entirely. The relationship between Dönitz and his submarine crews in the final period of the war has been characterized in various ways by historians, some emphasizing his genuine personal concern for the men under his command, others focusing on the ethical implications of continuing to send crews on patrols that could not achieve strategic results, and that carried extreme personal risk. The factual record of his communications shows both dimensions operating simultaneously. He maintained the professional correspondence with commanders and families. He continued to express confidence in operational communications that the strategic reality did not fully support. He pressed for the new technologies with an urgency that suggested genuine belief that they could yet change the outcome. Whether the combination of these elements constitutes inspiring leadership or willful dishonesty about strategic reality is a question that reasonable people continue to answer differently, and it may not have a single answer that covers all the evidence. What is clear is that the culture of the submarine arm held together as an institution through the worst of the final year in a way that reflects the depth of the professional bonds that have been built over years of shared danger and shared loss. The final patrols of the war carried their own texture of exhaustion and endurance. Crews that had been continuously operational for months, cycling through patrols and brief rests without the extended leave periods that normal war rhythms might have provided, were showing the cumulative effects of sustained operational stress. The medical literature of the period documents the physical and psychological effects of prolonged submarine service in conditions of high danger and inadequate rest conditions that affected crews across all navies, but that were particularly severe in a force where the loss rate had reached the levels the German submarine arm was experiencing in the final year. Men who had survived multiple patrols through the worst of the campaign, who had accumulated the experience and instinct that kept veterans alive in environments that killed newcomers, were precious to the institution precisely because they were irreplaceable. They were also, in some documented cases, reaching the limits of what sustained operational exposure could ask of human beings. The institution continued, the patrols continued, and the ocean, which had received so many of the arm's dead over 5 years, continued to offer no reassurance about the next one. The role of the surface fleet in the war's final phase, alongside the submarine arm's final patrols, was primarily one of support shore bombardment in support of army forces resisting Soviet advances, escort duty for the Baltic evacuation, and the management of mine-laying operations in waters where Allied advance threatened to open new sea lanes to German disadvantage. The heavy ships that remained operational, principally the Lützow and the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen, provided gunfire support to German army units along the Baltic coast with a competence and a consistency that ground force commanders found genuinely valuable, even as the strategic context made the purpose of that support increasingly difficult to justify in terms of the war's ultimate outcome. The gunfire could hold a Soviet advance for a day, for a week. It could not hold it permanently. The forces pressing westward along the Baltic coast were operating within a momentum that no available naval fire support could ultimately reverse. The mine warfare dimension of the Kriegsmarine's final operations is one of the least visible but most operationally significant. German mine-laying in the approaches to Baltic ports, in the North Sea, and in the coastal waters around Britain continued until the very end of the war. laying obstacles that would complicate Allied naval operations during the post-surrender clearance period, and that would claim ships and lives for months after Germany's formal surrender. Conversely, Allied mine-laying in Baltic waters, particularly by aircraft operating at night, dropping influence mines that responded to a ship's magnetic field or the pressure wave of its passage, had progressively restricted German naval movement in the Baltic during the war's final year. The mines did not distinguish between military vessels and evacuation ships. They were patient, indiscriminate, and enduring in a way that made them perhaps the most insidious element of the entire naval war. When Germany finally surrendered, one of the first tasks assigned to the surviving Kriegsmarine personnel was cooperation with Allied mine clearance operations, a final ironies of a war in which the weapons of one phase became the hazards of the next. The departure of the last operational submarines on patrol, in the days before Germany's surrender, carries a particular quality of institutional inertia, the continuation of operational procedures beyond the point where they served any strategic purpose, because the institutional machinery had its own momentum and because no one had yet given the order to stop. Submarines that were at sea when the surrender came received the cessation order by radio and were directed to surface, fly a black flag to indicate surrender, and proceed to designated Allied ports. Most complied. A few, most famously a small number, that made passages to Argentina and other distant ports rather than surrender to Allied forces, did not. The procedures for the transfer of surrendered submarines to Allied ports were managed largely by Kriegsmarine personnel cooperating with Allied naval officers, and they were carried out with a professional correctness that observers noted as characteristic of the institution even at the moment of its dissolution. The last Kriegsmarine submarines entered Allied ports flying their surrender signals in May of 1945, and the Battle of the Atlantic, which had begun on the very first day of the war in September 1939, ended not with a battle, but with the quiet, anticlimactic procedure of official surrender. Chapter 17: Surrender and the Nuremberg Reckoning. The unconditional surrender of Germany on the 8th of May, 1945 brought to a formal close a conflict that had consumed nearly 6 years of continuous European warfare and had touched the lives of virtually every human being in the continent. For the Kriegsmarine, the surrender had a particular institutional texture, the procedural correctness with which a professional military organization processes the most total form of defeat possible. The surviving commanders cooperated with Allied naval authorities in the technical business of disarming, surrendering, and sometimes scuttling their remaining vessels. The men who had spent the war trying to sink Allied ships now found themselves providing charts, technical data, and navigational assistance to the forces that had defeated them. The transition was abrupt in temporal terms and yet, by most accounts, professionally managed on both sides, a strange kind of normalcy descending on an institution that had been in continuous operation under continuous threat for the previous 5.5 years. Karl Dönitz had, in the final weeks of the war, been elevated to a position of political authority that he had never sought, and that the circumstances of the war's end thrust upon him without preparation or institutional logic. Hitler, in his final days in Berlin, had designated Dönitz as his successor, his chosen inheritor of the Reich presidency in his political testament. The choice was perhaps less surprising than it initially appears. Dönitz had been consistently loyal, had not been involved in the various plots and conspiracies that had complicated relations between Hitler and some of his army generals, and represented an institution that had, in Hitler's assessment, been less comprehensively defeated than the army. When Hitler died on the 30th of April, 1945, Dönitz became, formally, the last head of state of the Third Reich. He held this position for approximately 3 weeks, during which his primary preoccupation was managing the surrender process and continuing, as long as militarily possible, the Baltic evacuation that he regarded as the Kriegsmarine's most important final mission. The Nuremberg International Military Tribunal, which began its proceedings in November of 1945, included both Raeder and Dönitz among the defendants in the dock. The inclusion of naval commanders in a tribunal focused primarily on the crimes of the Nazi state and its leadership raised complex questions about the relationship between naval warfare and the laws of armed conflict, questions that were not easily answered within the framework of existing international law, and that produced some of the tribunal's most legally contested judgments. Raeder was convicted on counts related to crimes against peace and war crimes connected to the conduct of the naval war, and was sentenced to life imprisonment. He was released in 1955 on health grounds and died in 1960. Dönitz's trial produced a more legally complex outcome. The prosecution advanced charges related to the conduct of the submarine campaign, specifically the allegation that German submarines had conducted unrestricted submarine warfare, attacking merchant ships without warning and failing to provide for the safety of survivors in ways that violated the laws of armed conflict. The defense response drew on the testimony of American Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz, who provided a statement acknowledging that the United States Navy had conducted essentially similar unrestricted submarine warfare against Japan in the Pacific from the first day of American involvement in the war. The tribunal's judgment effectively found that the principle of reciprocity, that belligerents who had themselves conducted a practice could not consistently prosecute the other side for the same practice, constrained the war crimes charges related specifically to the submarine campaign. Dönitz was nonetheless convicted on charges related to crimes against peace and sentenced to 10 years imprisonment, which he served in full at Spandau Prison in Berlin. The legal and moral questions raised by the Nuremberg naval proceedings have occupied historians and legal scholars for the decades since the trial. The central tension is between the assessment of Dönitz as a professional naval commander conducting a legitimate, if brutal, campaign within the frameworks of naval warfare as it was then understood, and the assessment of him as an officer who served a criminal regime with apparent personal loyalty and without apparent moral reservation, and who therefore bears a share of responsibility for the wider system within which his campaign was embedded. Both assessments contain elements that are well supported by the evidence. Both contain elements that are contested. The question of whether those two assessments can be held simultaneously, the professional naval officer and the servant of a criminal state, is a question not merely about Dönitz personally, but about the broader moral situation of military professionals in political systems whose values they accept rather than resist. It is a question that has no comfortable resolution, and its discomfort is, perhaps, its most important quality. The surviving ships of the Kriegsmarine were distributed among the Allied powers following the surrender under the provisions of the armistice arrangements. The majority were either scrapped or sunk by their new owners, not out of military necessity, but as a symbolic and practical act of dissolution. The great concrete submarine pens at the French Atlantic bases, too massively constructed to be quickly demolished, remained as the most durable physical legacy of the German Atlantic campaign, monuments to an engineering ambition that outlasted the strategic purpose that had justified it. In the years after the war, most of the pens were adapted for civilian use as warehouses, as industrial facilities, eventually as cultural spaces, in some cases their brutal functionality repurposed into something that post-war communities found ways to live alongside, if never entirely comfortably with. The stone and concrete endured in the landscape long after the strategic logic that had produced them had dissolved into history. The men who survived the Kriegsmarine's war returned to a Germany that was physically destroyed, politically occupied, and engaged in the complex and painful process of confronting what the regime they had served had done. For men who had served primarily in the naval sphere, in submarines and on surface ships, the connection to the wider crimes of the regime was, in many cases, more attenuated than for those who had served in the army on the Eastern Front. This distance did not, and should not, translate into a moral blank. The Kriegsmarine operated within a system whose crimes were real and enormous, and the degree to which individual naval officers bore knowledge of and responsibility for those crimes varied considerably and has been the subject of serious historical inquiry. But it did mean that the experience of reintegration into post-war German society and the process of publicly reckoning with wartime service had a different texture for many former naval personnel than for their army counterparts. The figure of Dönitz cast a long shadow over the post-war submarine community. He emerged from Spandau in 1956, served no further public function, and spent the remaining decades of his life in quiet retirement in a small town in the Hamburg region, occasionally receiving visits from former subordinates and occasionally providing statements on historical matters. He died in December of 1980 at the age of 89, outliving Raeder by 20 years and surviving long enough to see the first public accounts of the ultra-intelligence program emerge, confirming what he had long suspected about the source of Allied operational advantages in the Atlantic. His memoirs, published in German in the 1950s and subsequently translated, present a commander's eye view of the submarine campaign that is self-serving in predictable ways and valuable in others. The self-justifications are identifiable and should be read as such. The operational details and the texture of command decision-making at the campaign's highest level are, within their inherent limitations, useful historical records. He wrote without apparent comprehension of the full moral weight of the regime he had served, and this absence is itself historically revealing. The Kriegsmarine's institutional legacy in the post-war world was absorbed, eventually, into the Bundesmarine, the naval force of the Federal Republic of Germany, established in the 1950s as West Germany rearmed within the NATO framework. The Bundesmarine was built around different principles and different institutional traditions than its predecessor, with explicit acknowledgement that the Kriegsmarine had served a criminal state and that the new navy must operate within different ethical and legal frameworks. Former Kriegsmarine personnel served in the Bundesmarine in some cases, but the institutional continuity was deliberately incomplete, a conscious effort to build something new rather than simply rename something old. The question of how institutions carry and transform the weight of their predecessors' history is one that the German Navy has engaged with more explicitly than many comparable military organizations, and that engagement is, in its own way, part of the Kriegsmarine's historical legacy, the ongoing obligation of the successor to reckon honestly with what the predecessor was and did. Chapter 18: Legacy, Memory, and the Cold Sea. History has a way of settling slowly around events that were, in their own time, lived at the speed of emergency. The Battle of the Atlantic was a campaign of 5.5 years, conducted in conditions of weather and danger and exhaustion that left its participants with memories so physically immediate: the smell of diesel, the sound of depth charges, the particular quality of Atlantic darkness at 3 a.m. that no written account can fully reconstruct them. The men who fought it on both sides carried those memories for the rest of their lives, and as they aged and died, the living memory of the campaign retreated into archives, memoirs, and the testimony of the dwindling number who survived to speak of it. By the early decades of the 21st century, the last participants were gone. What remained was history, which is always a partial, interpreted, and contested version of the thing itself. The Kriegsmarine's place in the history of the Second World War is, in one sense, straightforwardly determined. It fought and lost. The Atlantic campaign, which came closest to strategic significance in the critical months of late 1942, did not achieve its objective of severing Britain's maritime supply lines. The surface fleet, whose construction had absorbed enormous resources in the 1930s and early 1940s, never fulfilled the ambitions of Plan Z. The Norwegian campaign produced strategic gains at unsustainable tactical costs. The intelligence war was lost to Bletchley Park. The new submarine technologies arrived too late. By every criterion that defines the outcome of a military campaign, the Kriegsmarine failed in its essential strategic missions. This is a fact, and it should be acknowledged as one. But the story of a military force cannot be reduced to whether it won or lost, because that reduction eliminates the human complexity that makes the story worth examining in the first place. The Kriegsmarine was an institution built within an authoritarian state, committed to the service of a regime that committed crimes of enormous scale, and yet populated by men whose individual motivations, professional commitments, and personal moral situations were far more varied than a simple binary judgment allows. The submarine crews who departed the French Atlantic ports in the autumn of 1940 were mostly young, many of them teenagers or in their early 20s. They had grown up in the economic and political catastrophe of Weimar Germany, had come of age under the National Socialist system, and had joined the Navy as young men join military services everywhere seeking adventure, profession, belonging, purpose. The flag they sailed under was what it was. The world into which they were born was what it was. The judgments that history makes about the system they served do not need to be extended, undifferentiated, to every individual within it, even as the crimes of that system are acknowledged with full seriousness. The German submarine veterans who formed associations in the post-war decades were engaged, whether they articulated it in these terms or not, in the universal project of making sense of formative experience that does not easily yield to conventional narrative. Men who had survived combat of extreme intensity, who had lost friends and comrades in numbers that would be difficult to absorb under any circumstances, who had returned to a country that was engaged in the painful reckoning with what the regime they served had done. These were men working through a moral and psychological complexity that no simple formula of either pride or guilt could contain. Their gatherings, their publications, their maintenance of memorials and museums were attempts to preserve the memory of their own experience within a historical context that inevitably assigned that experience to a framework of political judgment they had not personally designed. The submarine memorial at Moltenort, near Kiel, which lists the names of the more than 30,000 German submariners who did not return from the war, is a monument to a specific scale of loss that exists independently of the political system within which that loss occurred, and which asks of those who read those names a quality of attention that pure political judgment cannot adequately provide. The post-war development of submarine technology and doctrine drew extensively on the technical legacy of the Kriegsmarine's advanced submarine program. The Type 21's design principles, high underwater speed, large battery capacity, streamlined hull form were adopted in modified forms by both the United States Navy and the Soviet Navy in the first post-war decade. The American Guppy program, which converted surviving wartime fleet submarines to incorporate many of the Type 21's performance characteristics, acknowledged directly the degree to which German submarine engineering had identified the right direction for underwater warship development, even if it could not implement that direction in time to matter for the war it was fighting. The Soviet Navy's post-war submarine program was similarly influenced by captured Type 21 examples and the German engineers who worked on Soviet programs under post-war arrangements of various kinds. The Cold War submarine race, which consumed extraordinary resources over 4 decades and shaped the strategic competition between the superpowers in ways that continue to echo, drew its technical foundations partly from the frieze, engineering work done in German yards and design offices in the final years of the Second World War. The maritime archaeology of the Atlantic campaign has produced, in the decades since the war, a physical record of extraordinary scope. The ocean floor of the North Atlantic holds the remains of hundreds of merchant ships and military vessels sunk during the campaign, along with the bodies of the men who went down with them and whose families never recovered them. Expeditions equipped with deep-sea survey technology have located and filmed many of these wrecks, including the remains of submarines, destroyers, and merchant vessels at depths that preserve them from salvage but not from the slow processes of biological and chemical dissolution. The images from these surveys steel hulls encrusted with marine growth, interiors collapsed under years of pressure, objects of personal and operational significance suspended in the cold stillness of the deep Atlantic, carry a quality of testimony that no written document can quite reproduce. They are the physical evidence of what it cost in metal and machinery and human lives to fight a maritime campaign of this scale. The Battle of the Atlantic and the wider Kriegsmarine campaign have been represented extensively in the cultural record in film, in literature, in documentary, in memoir. The German film Das Boot, released in 1981 and subsequently extended into a longer television series, is perhaps the most artistically significant representation of the submarine war from the German perspective. a film that portrays the submarine experience with a technical and psychological authenticity that was widely praised even by veterans of the campaign, and that managed the extraordinary feat of placing its audience emotionally inside the experience of submarine service without endorsing the political system within which that service was embedded. It remains, more than 4 decades after its initial release, one of the most enduring and widely seen representations of the Second World War in any medium. The degree to which it has shaped popular understanding of the submarine campaign for better and for worse, because even the best artistic representation is an interpretation rather than a record, is difficult to overstate. The naval balance of the Second World War, viewed in retrospect, was determined less by any single campaign or technology than by the fundamental asymmetry of industrial potential between the Allied coalition and the Axis powers. The Kriegsmarine was an institution that, at its best, demonstrated genuine creativity, technical sophistication, and professional quality. It produced tactical innovations, the Wolfpack, the acoustic torpedo, the Type 21 design that were not trivial. It conducted campaigns, the Atlantic submarine offensive, the Norwegian invasion, the Baltic evacuation that achieved results ranging from the significant to the extraordinary. But it was fighting as the naval arm of a continental land power against the combined maritime capacity of the British Empire and the United States, and the structural disadvantage of that position was one that no quality of individual or institutional performance could overcome. The history of the Kriegsmarine is partly a history of what a medium-scale naval power can achieve through creativity and commitment, and partly a history of what industrial scale, intelligence, advantage, and strategic position ultimately decide regardless of those qualities. Both halves of that history are true, and the full story requires both to be held in view simultaneously. The men of the merchant fleets, British, American, Canadian, Norwegian, Greek, and every other nationality that sailed Allied ships through the Atlantic during those years occupy a place in the history of the campaign that deserves particular recognition. They were not combatants in the formal sense. They did not choose to fight. They chose to sail, as they had always sailed, as their profession required. And in doing so, they absorbed casualties that, proportionally, exceeded those of most uniformed military services. A merchant sailor crossing the North Atlantic in the winter of 1942 faced odds of survival that would have been considered extraordinary even for a frontline soldier. They did it anyway, because the cargo had to move, because Britain had to be supplied, because the war's material requirements were non-negotiable. The ships they sailed have been commemorated in memorials and museums across the Allied world. The names of those who did not return are recorded on panels and walls in Liverpool and Halifax, in New York and Sydney. They were, in the truest operational sense, the reason the Battle of the Atlantic was being fought at all the people the Wolfpacks were trying to stop and the escort groups were trying to protect. Their endurance was the foundation on which Allied victory at sea was built. The Kriegsmarine's story ends, formally, on the 8th of May, 1945, with Germany's unconditional surrender. But in another sense, it ends on many different days, in many different places on the day the Bismarck sank in the North Atlantic in May 1941, on the day the Wolfpacks withdrew from the convoy routes in May 1943, on the day the Scharnhorst went down in Arctic waters in December 1943, on the day the Tirpitz capsized in Tromsø Fjord in November 1944, on the day the Wilhelm Gustloff sank in the Baltic in January 1945, on the day the last patrol submarine surfaced and flew its black surrender flag somewhere in the grey waters of the Atlantic or the North Sea, each of those days was somebody's ending. Each of them was a chapter in the longer story of an institution that began in humiliation, reached for strategic significance, came close enough to make the outcome genuinely uncertain for a critical period, and was ultimately defeated by a combination of forces, industrial, technological, intelligence, geographic, that its founders had not been able to fully anticipate or overcome. It was, in the end, a human story. The ships were machinery, the ocean was geography, the strategy was calculation. But underneath all of it, In every vessel and on every watch, in every sea condition the Atlantic could produce, were human beings trying, enduring, and paying the price of the world they had been born into. The ocean does not hold opinions about the campaigns that were fought across it. It was there before the Kriegsmarine existed, and it remains now, long after the last survivor of the campaign has gone. The North Atlantic swells still move in the same grey rhythms they maintained, while the wolf packs gathered and the convoys pressed through. The water is cold. The sky is wide. The depths are quiet. Somewhere down there, in the dark of the Atlantic floor, the steel hulls of the war still lie merchant ships and submarines. Surface escorts and armed trawlers slowly becoming part of the ocean that received them. They are beyond retrieval now. They are beyond the reach of argument or judgment. They are simply there, in the stillness and the cold, keeping their silence in the way that only the dead can keep it completely and forever. That is the history of the Kriegsmarine. That is the story of Hitler's navy. And now, if you have travelled this far with us, through the ashes of Versailles, through the grey Atlantic, through the fjords of Norway and the ice of the Arctic and the cold waters of the Baltic, it is time to rest. The story is complete. The ocean is quiet. Let the sound of the water carry you slowly into sleep. If this documentary kept you company tonight, consider sharing it with someone who might need a few quiet hours with history. And when you wake, there are many more long stories waiting because the past is vast and the nights are long and there is always more worth knowing. Sleep well.